The story begins in a castle in a county called Indigentia. A girl named Elia started a new life in this magical world. Just at that moment, the little Duke Caleb embraces the girl and persuades her not to divorce her older brother. Elia's husband is named Cedric, and he is an archduke. Cedric asks his little brother not to whine and not to cause problems for Elia. But Caleb is sure that without Elia, the terrible monster under the bed will eat him the next night. And his older brother is a fool. Elia thinks that her contract has expired, and Cedric is the strongest in this world. But Caleb is destined to become a great evil. The young duke will become a great wizard who controls darkness. Cedric tries to tear Caleb away from Elia. Elia tries to separate the brothers and wonders why Cedric is so angry. However, the brothers continue to quarrel, and we are transported to the past, where the girl realizes that she has been reborn and found herself in Elia's body. In the world of the novel, which the author has safely forgotten about, according to the book, the girl was now 23 years old and was the main female character. On the bed, Elia found the manuscript of that very novel, and outside the window, I discovered a fairy tale forest. Without thinking twice, the girl went for a walk. The weather was beautiful, and there was a new world to explore. Sitting down to rest under a spreading tree, the girl realized that she was absolutely happy. A new world full of wonders awaited her. Having regained her strength, Elia set out to explore the forest. She knew exactly what story she was lucky enough to be in. That should help. While walking, the girl met cute animals. The forest delighted her more and more. Suddenly, a boy ran out of the forest with a wolf chasing him. Without thinking twice, Elia rushed to help. From somewhere, a strange confidence appeared in the girl that she would defeat the beast. The boy ran up and hid behind Elia's back. The wolf growled and prepared to attack. He had no intention of letting his prey go. The next moment, the beast rushed at Elia. Turning around, the girl threw the wolf into the air with a powerful kick. Elia froze in fear, amazed at her own strength. The boy peered out from behind the girl, not believing his luck. Having come to his senses, the first thing he did was thank his savior, and he promised to repay her for her help. The boy's manners were impeccable. The more Elia looked at the child, the more she couldn't believe her eyes. He looked very much like the girl's younger brother, Yoon. The resemblance was striking. The boy looked at Elia's face, which was shining with delight and hope, in bewilderment. No, the child's name was Caleb, and he was the Duke of Indigentia. The realization hit Elia like a powerful wave. In the novel she had read, and in which she found herself, this child was the villain. The story moves to Elia's homeworld, where Yoon, the girl's brother, suffered from a rare disease. They had no other relatives, and Elia did everything she could to cure her brother. The girl promised Yoon to win a gold medal in Taekwondo in order to get money and transfer him to the best hospital. Elia kept her word and won, but before she could, Yoon died. At the boy's request, no one told the girl anything until she won. But now the medal had no meaning. Elia locked herself at home, ignoring journalists and all her acquaintances. All she wanted was to escape from reality. One day, while endlessly scrolling through internet pages, she came across a colorful advertisement for a novel. Among the characters was a villainous boy who looked exactly like Yoon. The novel became Elia's life, and now she sees this villainous boy in front of her, with the voice and appearance of her dead brother. Suddenly, Elia notices blood running down Caleb's hand. There were some strange cuts on the boy's palm. They couldn't have been left by a wolf. Without thinking twice, Elia calls Caleb into the house where she woke up, having moved into this world. But as soon as they start moving, Caleb begins to limp, and it turns out that he has a dislocation. Despite the pain, the boy behaves remarkably calmly, showing only sadness. Elia recalls that in the novel, all the nobles hated Caleb for some reason. The young duke was taught from childhood to maintain high standards and control his emotions. I remember Yoon behaved in exactly the same way, afraid of upsetting his sister even more. Elia decides to carry the boy and offers to climb onto her shoulders. For Caleb, this is almost the first act of care in his life. He is both touched and embarrassed because his weakness has been noticed. After some hesitation, the boy finally accepts Elia's help. At home, Elia treats the boy's hand and tries to calm her heart, which sees the Duke as her dead brother. The child continues to talk about his magic. With it, he wouldn't be so helpless. While the new friends drink cocoa together, Elia ponders how such a sweet boy could ever become such a great evil. Elia has been given another life in the magical world and wants to spend it in peace. This child needs to be sent home. The Duke's mug was rapidly emptying, and Elia realized that Caleb was hungry. He hasn't eaten anything since early morning. It turns out that, for the Duke, feeling hungry is a normal state, because the teachers put the boy on a diet. In fact, the child began to be starved to death when he was 7 years old. Elia immediately starts cooking. She can wait until the boy returns. First, he must eat as much as he can. There was nothing in the house except potatoes, but Elia did the best she could. The amazed Caleb hesitantly began to eat the first course. He was clearly still thinking about the prescribed diet, but Elia was unstoppable. Having skewered the potato pancake onto her fork, she practically shoved the food into the boy's mouth. Neither Caleb's words nor his embarrassment could stop the girl. The young Duke admitted that the taste of all the dishes was amazing. Finally throwing off his inhibitions, Caleb pounced on the food. After dinner, the child fell asleep like a log. The awakening was panic-stricken. He slept until almost noon. Caleb breathed a sigh of relief, realizing that he had not woken up in a palace. For the first time in a long time, the Duke slept well, because he was not tormented by nightmares. The past flashed before Caleb's eyes, blood flowing down the sword, and a tall, terrifying figure. The gloomy thoughts were interrupted by the cheerful Elia. The girl returned with a huge bag full of groceries. History is silent on how she managed to obtain so much, but Elia was definitely determined. With the same joyful enthusiasm, the girl began to prepare breakfast. Meanwhile, a puzzled Caleb was building theories about his mysterious savior. Incredibly strong, great cook, caring. Noticing Caleb's confusion, Elia turned to him, but the embarrassed boy was unable to ask a single important question. He just asked not to let him sleep so much. After all, he is the heir to the duchy, and the rules must be observed. However, Elia's concern, like an avalanche, swept away all of Caleb's objections. Now he is not a duke, but just a boy. No one will stop him from sleeping, eating, and playing as much as he wants. Tears welled up in Caleb's eyes. The boy had never heard such words in his entire life. Wherever they went, he was the heir and had to live up to it. And this girl turned everything upside down in just one day. Unable to contain herself, Elia stroked the boy's head, and then, embarrassed, she returned to cooking. The Duke watched her in shock. All his life, he had been obliged to study and meet standards. At the slightest mistake, the boy received blows with a ruler on his fingers. Hard, strong, leaving bloody wounds. For the first time in many years, Caleb was happy, even though he was now breaking all the rules he knew. After eating, Elia brewed chamomile tea. The girl was happy to take care of the boy, who looked so much like her deceased brother. Caleb wanted to know more about Elia. However, he wisely decided to start by telling about himself. The conversation left Elia confused. She liked the young Duke, but she couldn't let him deeply into her heart. There will be no harm if the child speaks out. Caleb looked up at the girl, embarrassed. He was clearly collecting his thoughts, not knowing where to begin. Elia, however, was determined to simply listen and not interfere. It was so difficult to talk about myself, so Caleb decided to start the story with his older brother. Cedric Kedisel, adopted when he was 10, had already mastered gravity magic perfectly by the age of 13, and he also revived the magic of weather, which was lost more than 150 years ago. Only Cedric was cursed. The entire county is searching for the curse caster and the only one who can lift it, but so far without success. Elia remembers that the novel spoke of a curse. It was cast by a fairy, and it was because of it that Caleb would fall into darkness. However, the novel itself told the story of Renoa, the prince of the Ypresant Empire, and his beloved Daphne Marinist. In the novel, a fairy appeared to the prince and tried to cast a sleeping spell on him. Daphne deflected the curse with magic. From this moment on, their love story begins. It seems that by the time Elia got into the novel, this story had already happened. Caleb continues to tell the story, saying that his brother's curse can be lifted in the Temple of Knowledge in the Emperor's palace. The temple contains all the knowledge of the world. Only the heads of the Maishalat, Marinest, and Indigentia families can enter. Since ancient times, Maishalat have mastered material magic, Marinest, water magic, and Indigentia, gravity. So, to gain access, you need to be an archduke. But Cedric refuses the title and insists that Caleb rule. The boy hesitates as he speaks of his greatest fear, that he will not be able to lift the curse from his brother. That's why he tries so hard to comply with stupid rules. For his brother, Caleb is ready to do anything. Elia knows that the boy will become an archduke. But on the very day of inheriting the title, Cedric's condition will sharply worsen, and no book will help him. Caleb will also not find any information about the fairy, but one day he will hear that she was captured by the Emperor's family. He will immediately rush to the dungeon where she is being held, but the fairy will already be killed. This way, Caleb will understand that there was a conspiracy in the imperial family. The Archduke will hate all members of the imperial family, including Prince Renoa. For the sake of his brother, Caleb will become fascinated with dark magic and plunge into darkness. There is nothing Elia can do to change his future. The girl shook her head. Caleb is not Yun, and everything, even if everything is predetermined. But now he is just a child, and he needs help, love, and care. Caleb stayed for one more night, and then another day and another day. They didn't notice how a whole week had flown by. The young duke has changed a lot during this time. He began to laugh again, the eternal expression of tension and detachment gone. They played a lot in the forest with Elia. They played, ran, and made wreaths. Caleb's dislocated leg and ruler-bruised fingers healed fairly quickly. Now, the boy openly expressed his feelings, as befits a child of his age. The forest animals reached out to Caleb and happily sat in his arms. But for some reason, they didn't like Elia. Probably because she wasn't that nice. What Caleb loved most was holding Elia's hand. And Elia, no matter how hard she tried to close her heart, became more and more attached to the boy every day. It's unclear what to do when the time comes to let him go back to the duchy, or when the great and powerful Cedric finds his brother. Sooner or later it will happen. Meanwhile, snowfall had been continuing in the county for a week. Cedric Kettisel used weather magic at full power. Just now, Advisor Edwin came to him once again to beg the ruler to stop the weather madness. The castle gates are frozen, the vassals cannot leave, and the harvest will soon begin to perish. But Cedric was adamant. He would only stop the blizzard when he found Caleb. The man suggests that the vassals focus on finding the rightful heir instead of lamenting, and if they freeze in their search, so be it. Edwin had no choice but to bow and leave. Cedric remained sitting at the table, clenching his fists. Anxiety tore at the elder brother's heart. He involved all the information guilds in the search, even those used by the Emperor himself. Looks like I'll have to turn to the Dark Guild. Caleb was spending another wonderful evening at Elia's house. Elia called the boy from the bathroom. It was time to change the bandage. The bruised fingers healed very well, but extra caution never hurt. With a practiced movement, the girl removed the old bandages, smeared Caleb's fingers with healing ointment, and applied a new bandage. In a couple of days, the Duke will be completely healthy. His magic will return completely, and the time will come to return to the castle. With the usual movements, the friends curled up under the blanket on Elia's huge bed. The girl understood that the time for separation would soon come. But fatigue took its toll, and Elijah fell asleep. But Caleb could not sleep. He stayed here too long. The fairy tale does not last forever. The boy remembered his last conversation with his brother with longing. Once again, Caleb tried to convince the stubborn man to accept the title and get rid of the curse. The thought of losing Cedric was unbearable, but the brother refused once again. However, this time, the brother mentioned that there was another way to enter the Temple of Knowledge. For several days, Caleb wandered around the castle in thought, trying to understand, until I overheard a conversation between two maids. It turns out that Cedric can simply get married. Marriage will prove loyalty to the Indigenia family and automatically grant access to the temple. However, finding a spouse will be difficult. Rumors have already spread that Cedric's curse is contagious. Women did not want to take risks and take such risks, even though these could have been just rumors. And what was also very upsetting was Cedric's distrust, who didn't tell Caleb anything. Elia sighed and stirred in her sleep, bringing the boy back to reality. But Elia can marry her older brother. They can be so happy, all three of them. And then Caleb won't have to part with Elia. If they get married, Cedric will enter the Temple of Knowledge. And then he will lift the curse and get divorced. And Elia will remain in the castle as a savior, no longer bound by any ties. And Caleb will finally stop feeling so lonely and lost. Another thing is that one cannot subject an innocent girl to such tests. They could both die. This plan is just a childish illusion. The next day began with the same bright sun, and the same joyful Elia, eager to feed Caleb something more delicious. The sleep-deprived boy looked distant and apathetic. It was as if I had returned to the state I was in before I met Elia. But the girl didn't give up. Now she would prepare Caleb's favorite dishes. However, she must not give in to weakness and interfere in the boy's life. Trying to act normal, Elia sent Caleb outside to get lemons. Fresh air should do the boy good. And after eating, you can go for a walk together. The forest dwellers should distract the child from sad thoughts. Suddenly, a figure in a dark cloak appeared in the doorway. Wheezing something, she stretched out her hands to Caleb. Without further thought, Elia grabbed the frying pan and threw it at her enemy's head with all her might. The figure collapsed as if mown down, and the girl prepared to protect the child to the end. The stranger is probably planning to kidnap Caleb. Suddenly, the boy rushed towards the lying figure with joyful cries. It turns out that Elia just knocked out the most powerful mage in this world, Cedric. It was probably rather awkward. The man lay in a semi-conscious state and moaned quietly. The girl could only apologize and deal with the consequences. To begin with, Elia and Caleb carried the man to the bed. Then the girl brought a cold towel, and the Duke applied it to his elder brother's forehead. Despite the irony of the situation, it began to dawn on Caleb that the fairy tale was ending. Elia tried to predict the reaction of the injured man. He might wake up and attack her. Having sent Caleb to wet the towel again, the girl remained by the bed. After thinking about it, she reached for Cedric's shirt to unbutton the collar. Of course, it was this moment that the man chose to regain consciousness. The situation that arose left both of them somewhat confused. Elia blushed and pulled her hand away. Having finally come to his senses, the man began to ask why Elia had kidnapped Caleb, and why did she create a magical barrier to prevent the search for the young Duke. Elia looked at Cedric in complete shock. The girl turned around and rushed after Caleb. The boy had to clarify the situation, and then she sank heavily to the floor. Cedric instantly used gravity magic. The magician had no intention of letting go of his brother's kidnapper. Elia looked back at Cedric, hunted. A wet towel hit the elder's face with a slap, and Caleb burst into the room screaming. The angry boy stood up to defend Elia, demanding that the gravity spell be cancelled. Elia saved his life. No one has the right to treat her like that. Confused, Cedric snapped his fingers and lifted the spell, and he expressed surprise as to why Caleb was still not in the duchy. After all, he was able to put up a magical barrier. Elia looked at the boy in surprise. She remembered the injury to her hand. Caleb burst into tears. All this time he was deceiving the girl, wanting to stay with her a little longer. Perhaps their friendship will now be destroyed. Elia hugged the boy tenderly. Caleb had nothing to apologize for. She was happy to spend time with the child. It was so strange. Elia clearly remembered that in the original novel, the young Duke never cried. Suddenly, Caleb exhaled sharply, and in one breath invited Elia to go with him to the castle and marry his brother. Elia looked at the Duke in confusion, not knowing what to answer. Soon evening came, and the boy, tired from all the events, fell asleep. Elia wandered around the kitchen in complete confusion. It was necessary to make tea and probably cook something. Hearing the noise, the girl turned around. Behind her stood a shirtless Cedric. His shirt was wet, and he took off his clothes to dry off before leaving the house. Pulling herself together, the girl put the cups on the table. Cedric's perfect torso really embarrassed Elia. He looked better than the most trained guys in the girl's homeworld. The girl didn't know where to hide her eyes. Cedric finished his tea and bowed before Elia, asking for forgiveness for the attack. Elia blushed to the roots of her hair and handed the man a blanket. Cedric thanked the girl for taking care of his brother. The conversation returned to Caleb's proposal. Marriage. Very little was said about Cedric in the novel. Elia had no idea what kind of man was sitting in front of her. Meanwhile, the man talked about his curse and the Temple of Knowledge. Only the Archduke can enter there, or someone who will undergo a ceremony where they will take an oath of allegiance to the Indigentia family. However, only a blood relative can perform the ceremony, and Cedric was adopted. If they get married, Elia will be considered Cedric's relative, and the ceremony can take place. The only problem is that the curse is considered contagious, and no one wants to marry the man. Rumors about this were spread deliberately, but women simply don't want to take the risk. However, Cedric will completely understand if Elia believes the rumors. Elia's heart sank with sympathy for Cedric, and Caleb, who was ready to do anything just to spend a little longer with the girl. The girl controls her emotions and asks Cedric why he is so insistent that Caleb accept the title. It would be much more logical to become an archduke himself and resolve the issue with the curse. Cedric reveals that Caleb was kidnapped immediately after birth. They searched for him for 4 years and found him in an orphanage. A shocked Aaliyah recalls the original story. The carriage leaving the orphanage was attacked. Only Caleb survived the massacre. Until now, nothing was known about the kidnappers, the attackers, or the reasons for what happened. Since then, most of the vassals hate Caleb. Some blame him for what happened, while others think that, in fact, he is not the true heir, and that an impostor has returned from the orphanage. Caleb must become an archduke for his own safety. Cedric will find another way to deal with the curse. The brothers do everything to protect each other, and it is this that will ultimately lead them into darkness. However, Elia remembered the truth. The temple would not help. There was no way to remove the curse. If the girl really wants to help, if she wants to intervene in this story, then you just need to remember who the fairy was in the novel. The imperial family caught her when Caleb had already become an archduke. Then it will be too late, so we need to remember where the fairy is now. The difficulty is that her name and face are mentioned only once, at the very end of the novel. Come on, Aaliyah, stop staring at Cedric's chest and remember. After all, if we find the fairy, the curse will be lifted, and history will go completely differently. Cedric looked at Aaliyah with concentration. Suddenly, Aaliyah's heart skipped a beat and froze somewhere in her throat. The fairy had unusually beautiful eyes, shining like precious stones, and silver hair with a pink tint. The fairy lived in a beautiful house far away from all the counties. The girl sank noisily to the floor, struck by a sudden realization. It turns out that the fairy who put a curse on Cedric is Elia herself. In the morning, joyful news awaited Caleb. Aaliyah agreed to marry Cedric and goes with him to the castle. But none of the brothers knew what was really going on in the girl's head, although Cedric seemed to notice her nervousness. Or it was his own shock. After all, yesterday, Elia first announced to the man another way to remove the curse, and then abruptly proposed to marry her. The culprit frantically went over the information in her head. She was a fairy, and she had cursed Cedric. More precisely, it was the previous real Elia who did this. The girl herself has no idea about magic, and has no idea how to remove the curse. However, if someone finds out, no one will believe the girl. Caleb will think that all this time Elia was mocking their suffering. Of course, she could refuse her brothers now and run away, but in a few years the emperor would have to catch her. And in the dungeon, for unknown reasons, the fairy dies. The safest place to stay is in Indigenia. Watch Cedric's curse and gradually learn magic. And when the curse is lifted, I can finally leave and live a happy single life. Yes, the curse was not cast by the girl herself, but she felt responsible for the actions of her predecessor. Meanwhile, Cedric was telling Caleb that the marriage would be by contract, until the curse is lifted, to which the boy replied that he had already thought of everything. Aaliyah doesn't need to return to this house, even after the divorce. Caleb will declare himself the girl's official guardian, and she will be able to stay in the castle. She'll definitely like it there. Something subtly changed in the boy. He became confident and somehow imperious. Cedric saw Elia's confusion, and he tried to gently convince his brother, because the girl might have her own plans. She has already done a lot for them. Caleb looked up at his older brother in bewilderment. Elia enjoyed spending time with the young duke. To smooth over the awkwardness, Cedric suggested that they get ready to go. The boy immediately happily extended his hand to Elia. A new round of history awaited the girl. We need to figure out what she really feels for Caleb. It's all about the similarity with Yoon. But maybe there's something else. And it is necessary that no one finds out that she is not sweet Elia, but a fairy who cast a curse. Also, we need to get to know Cedric better, and at the same time, not become completely attached to any of the brothers. Snow hid her face, interrupting the girl's thoughts. They were standing on the threshold of a huge castle. Of course, Cedric instantly restored the weather, and summer returned to the duchy. Aaliyah felt like a princess in a beautiful dress and with a new hairstyle. The castle fascinated her more and more, even though she still knew nothing about it. However, the meeting with the vassals was to become a new test. However, it was necessary to announce both the marriage and the fact that Caleb had been found. For now, Aaliyah could rest peacefully in her chambers. But Cedric was already awaited by advisor Edwin at the next meeting. Caleb unexpectedly also expressed a desire to participate. Such initiative had not previously been typical of the boy. He was greatly influenced by Elia's presence. Caleb realized that he was ready to do anything to ensure the girl's safety. Elia looked with admiration at the suddenly matured Duke. Cedric was also amazed. His little brother had changed so much in just a few days. Joyful and self-confident, Caleb hurried after his older brother. Elia was left alone, on the one hand. It was right to go with the boy. But, on the other hand, he will soon become an archduke, and he needs to learn to cope on his own. Suddenly, a beautiful girl bowed before Elia. Her name was Olivia, and she was the guest's personal maid. Elia was not accustomed to such luxury. Caleb, meanwhile, entered the assembly hall. There was a loud argument in the hall, with Marcus Reynold Babylon being particularly vocal. The reason for the discussion was the upcoming marriage of Cedric and Elia. The elder brother's face was distorted with anger, because the vassals openly named him the next ruler. They didn't give a damn about Caleb. Cedric abruptly interrupted all arguments, advising his vassals to be careful. The faces of the people sitting at the table showed irritation and fear. Cedric has already frozen the entire castle. Who knows what else he might do? But the greatest displeasure was on the Marquise's face. Reynold was the older brother of the previous Archduchess and always dreamed of power. First, he spread the rumor that Cedric's curse was contagious, and then he planned to eliminate Caleb. The Marquis easily influenced the minds of his vassals through his daughter Gerald, who taught Caleb etiquette. Reynold planned to marry Gerald to Cedric when he became Archduke. When Cedric, due to the curse, falls into eternal sleep, all power will remain in the hands of the Marquis. But Elia's appearance ruined everything. Cedric, meanwhile, was talking about Elia attending etiquette lessons with Caleb. The hot-tempered Marquis, whose plan had collapsed, insulted the girl in his heart, to which Caleb reacted sharply, ahead of his brother. The vassals were shocked. The usually quiet and modest child now literally overwhelmed everyone with his mere presence. The people at the table fell silent in fear. The Marquis had already come to his senses. Gerald would teach them both. There would still be a chance to implement the plan. Elia, meanwhile, admired her quarters. A soft bed, delicious food, skincare, sweet dreams, and a wonderful morning. Elia couldn't stop admiring herself in the mirror. Olivia was already rolling the breakfast table into her chambers, which was simply bursting with food. While Elia was looking at the dishes, Olivia said that Cedric was waiting for the girl after breakfast, and she needs to think about what she will look like. After all, Elia is going to meet her fiancé. You need to look flawless. The morning, as usual, found Cedric at work. The man did not look up from his papers, even when they announced that Elia had arrived. He also muttered the formal phrases of greeting without raising his head. But then he looked at Elia and was speechless. Olivia did a great job. The girl looked dazzling. For a moment, Cedric was speechless, and Elia looked at him with incomprehension and smiled. Finally, Cedric pulled himself together, and he asked the girl to wait on a small sofa in the reception area. Elia had just sat down when a male voice called out to her. Advisor Edwin, Cedric's chief assistant, bowed before her. Edwin began to tell the reason why Cedric called the girl, but looking at her, for some reason, he blushed and became embarrassed. And then Cedric appeared from his office. With a snap of his fingers, the man erected a glowing barrier against eavesdropping and sat down on the sofa opposite Elia. Cedric began the conversation with the girl's memories. She couldn't, honestly, tell her future husband about another world. I had to lie about amnesia. Otherwise, the girl would inevitably be asked questions about her relatives, friends, and, in general, her past. Caleb simply took Elia at her word. But something tells me that Cedric won't be fooled so easily. Leaving the topic of amnesia aside, the man handed Elia the contract. The contract was concluded for 3 years, with the possibility of extension. Moreover, Elia was entitled to a significant sum of money every month. Over the entire term of the contract, she will receive 3 billion gold. In her past life, this amount would have been enough for Elia to buy a house. But not everything is so smooth. This sum was both a payment for silence and compensation for the lack of freedom. The contract consisted of many clauses in small print. For example, one of them said that Elia did not have the right to leave the duchy, except for official visits. Then the girl must be accompanied by one of her brothers. A knightly order will be created to protect Elia. One of them will accompany her constantly. Cedric presented it as protection, but Elia understood everything. In fact, members of the order will be watching her every move. Spy for Cedric. Speechless, Elia looked at the man in silence, and he seemed to be grinning, with the very corner of his lips. The girl had no choice but to smile broadly and say that she agreed to everything. Such resignation stunned Cedric. He expected violent objections from the girl. Elia calmly stated that she would do anything to establish trust between them. A thoughtful Cedric suggested that the girl read all the terms of the contract and let him know if she wants to add or change anything. The girl ran her eyes over the lines again. Everything was composed perfectly. All that remains is to wait for the contract to end, and this money will last her for a long time. But there is still Caleb. Elia raised her head resolutely. She wants to include a clause that will allow her to visit Caleb after the divorce. Cedric's eyes widened again in surprise and alarm. He was worried about his younger brother. Elia, suddenly realizing it, said that she felt like her memories were returning with Caleb. Cedric promised to talk to his brother about this. Elia smiled happily, seeming to light up the entire room. The man froze, unable to take his eyes off her. Elia exhaled loudly as she left the office. Seeing Olivia approaching her, the girl quickly put on a welcoming mask. Cedric, meanwhile, looked thoughtfully at the contract. He waited for Elia to argue about the restrictions. Edwin was going on and on about how beautiful Elia was. The advisor noticed that the girl's eyes looked like precious stones. Only fairies have something like this. Combined with beautiful long hair, this could well indicate pure fairy blood. Edwin shut up, meeting Cedric's cold gaze. The advisor did a great job assessing the situation so quickly. However, very little is known about fairies. Cedric again remembered the girl's dazzling beauty. So far, we can only say that she is very emotional and kind. The girl's past is shrouded in mystery. At that moment, Elia's thoughts were torn between the huge sum and the desire for freedom, and Cedric's beauty, as well as concern for Caleb. The future spouses thought about each other almost simultaneously. Noticing Cedric's smile, the advisor teased his friend, for which he immediately paid with the paperwork being sorted out. The elder brother went to Caleb to discuss the clause that Elia wanted to include in the contract. So everything was almost agreed upon, and all that remained was to prepare for the wedding. One thing was bothering Cedric. He had lost his sense of smell due to the curse, but he could smell a faint floral scent from Elia. Perhaps he just imagined it. The dining room was flooded with sunshine. Caleb looked up from his steak in surprise at Elia's offer. The elder brother calmly waited for an answer. Of course, Caleb had nothing against it. Moreover, he was thinking hard about how to keep Elia in the castle after the divorce. The brothers continued to chat leisurely over a sumptuous meal. Caleb's classes will resume tomorrow, including etiquette classes with Elia. Cedric noticed that despite the good news, his brother looked unhappy. But Caleb answered something unintelligible. There was never any trust between the brothers. Elia went to explore the castle courtyard. The weather was simply wonderful. How could it be otherwise when the duchy is headed by a weather mage? Looking at the graceful parapets, Elia wondered why she had not seen any of the vassals yet. So far, everyone has been kind to her, but everything could change at any moment. How wonderful it would be to bring back the memory of the real Elia. Suddenly, Elia noticed the maids whispering. Cedric and Caleb are finally having lunch together right now, but they still feel uncomfortable with each other. It turns out that the brothers don't get along. However, in the novel, they were very friendly. They must both be so lonely. So that's why Olivia reacted so strangely at lunch. Elia decided to have lunch at her place, so as not to disturb the two brothers. After all, they hadn't seen each other for a long time. The girl also wanted to get closer to Olivia. The maid hesitated strangely when Elia said she wanted to give the brothers some time alone. And now it has become clear why. There is no particular warmth between them. Elia heard Caleb's ringing voice. The boy called her, waving his arms joyfully. The girl immediately asked how the boy's lunch with his older brother went. Caleb hesitated for a second, but then he immediately put on a clever, cheerful mask. If Elia hadn't known the truth, she wouldn't have noticed anything. But now I need to focus on walking with Caleb. The friends walked for a long time. Fortunately, the castle grounds were simply enormous. Caleb seemed to be rediscovering familiar places. Tired, they sat down on a bench near a picturesque fountain. The boy admitted that he is immensely happy when Elia is next to him. Then, the conversation turned to the upcoming etiquette classes. Caleb was worried that Elia would see his ineptitude and become disappointed. The child promised to try his best. The girl was so stunned that at first, she didn't even understand the point. It was stupid to be disappointed because a friend couldn't do something. A child already at the age of 7 believes that only the strong and skillful can be loved. However, it quickly became clear that the boy did not come up with this idea himself. Someone told him outright that Elia would be disappointed in him if he performed poorly. It remains to be seen who and why. Find out why the child is being made to doubt himself. Elia tried to carefully find out the source of this statement. Caleb responded with instant fear. He thought that he had angered the girl with his careless words. Elia remembered how she met the boy. His bruised fingers, sad eyes, uncertainty, desire to starve. All this returned after returning to the castle. And then it dawned on Elijah. She asked the young duke to show his palms. The child hesitated and tried to hide his hands behind his back. However, Elia was persistent. As expected, there were marks of blows on the boy's palms. The girl began to ask worriedly about the wounds. But Caleb said that everything was fine. He was just being punished for disobedience. It's normal in his world, he's just not good enough. And the teacher cares about him. Because if the boy falls behind the program, people will hate him. Moreover, the traces of the blows must be hidden. Otherwise, everyone will know that Caleb is worthless and will become disillusioned with him. Elia remembered that in the novel, the etiquette teacher was Gerald, the daughter of Marquis Renaud. The Marquis desperately tried to marry his daughter to Cedric, but Cedric refused, and now Gerald apparently regularly brainwashed Caleb. So the Marquis tried to seize power without even trying to hide it. Elia asked if Caleb had told his older brother about this. The boy confidently answered negatively. His brother was too busy. The teacher told him not to distract him with chatter about lessons. According to her, at every meal, Caleb irritated Cedric with his conversations, and the boy needs to concentrate on his studies and not fill his head with all sorts of nonsense. What struck Elijah most was Caleb's confident tone. He never doubted his teacher for a moment. So the reason for the lack of trust between the brothers was found. The Marquis used his daughter and vassals to lead Caleb and Cedric into a trap. Gerald had completely convinced the boy that his older brother hated him. Caleb believed and began to keep his distance. Cedric, driven by his complexes, believed that the younger one hated him. What adds fuel to the fire is that Cedric is completely incapable of expressing his feelings and trusting. We end up in a vicious circle of emotions with no hope of escape. Cedric's actions scream love. He gave up the title and the opportunity to lift the curse. In the novel, he dies, but never betrays his younger brother. But they don't have trust at the everyday level. It was necessary to urgently correct the situation. Elia crouched down in front of Caleb and gently touched the child's palms. Her voice was soft and gentle. She said that it is impossible to teach children like that no one has the right to punish him, and because of his mistakes, the boy does not become bad. The child was shocked to the depths of his soul. Elia questioned everything Gerald told him. Neither a teacher's good education nor her upbringing give her the right to beat children. Elia gently asked about the boy's feelings during etiquette lessons. He admitted that he always felt like he wasn't trying hard enough, that he is bad and nothing can fix it, that he deserved the punishments that Gerald was handing out to him. That's also why he didn't show anyone the abrasions on his hands. The child always wanted to ask someone else if he was really bad, but he was afraid that Cedric would hate him even more, and there was no one else to go to. Depressing thoughts and self-hatred burned the child day after day. He really wants to believe Elia, but he believed Gerald for so long. She can't be wrong about everything. Tears rolled down Caleb's cheeks. Elia hugged the boy tenderly and advised him to believe in himself more. Don't blindly trust the words of others. First listen to what your own heart tells you. Evening came while we were talking. Elia took Caleb to his chambers, and then she went to her room. On the way, the girl was simply seething with anger. Suddenly, Cedric called out to her. The man asked why he and Caleb had been walking for so long. Elia replied that the youngest was showing her the castle. The girl also remembered the boy's request not to tell Cedric about his wounds yet. Caleb wanted to find the courage to confess himself. Therefore, Elia limited herself to a neutral conversation about the beauty of the castle grounds. She looked slightly distant and hurried to say goodbye. A puzzled Cedric had no choice but to end the conversation. Elia walked further down the corridor, now angry at Cedric as well. The man positioned himself as the ruler of the duchy, but at the same time, he could not see beyond his own nose. However, tomorrow was the first encounter with Gerald. It was necessary to separate them from Marquis Renaud as quickly as possible. It will be difficult to pull this off alone, but it is necessary for Gerald to stop influencing Caleb as quickly as possible. Elia realized that she would not go anywhere until the teacher left the duchy. The new day was just as warm and sunny. Olivia dressed Elia in another, no less beautiful dress. Overnight, the girl came up with a plan to get rid of Gerald. I needed to talk to Cedric. However, this does not reveal any of Caleb's secrets to him. The only way out is to find some shortcomings in Gerald's teaching and highlight them. Elia would like to regain her fairy magic and solve problems easily and naturally. Or you can just beat Gerald. But we will leave this solution as a last resort. Elijah was met by a beaming, ready-to-learn Caleb. The friends agreed to have breakfast together next time. The boy looked much happier than yesterday. It seems he got enough sleep and his anxious thoughts became less intense. Today, we could try having lunch with him and Cedric. But first, there's a lesson in etiquette. A graceful, fair-haired girl sat down in front of them. She was all sparkling with kindness and friendliness. Looks like it'll be hard to beat one like that. Moreover, the teacher had a pleasant melodic voice. Gerald suggested starting the training with walking. Elia immediately felt a little uneasy. But Gerald broke into a wide smile and said that Elia's gait was excellent. There are only a few minor comments. A steely glint appeared in the teacher's sparkling eyes. Gerald continued to praise Elia during the second exercise, and the third and the fourth. Gradually, the girl began to relax. And then the teacher became serious. Changing her intonation, she said that Elia was learning too slowly. If this continues, Cedric will be very disappointed. Elia needs to put in a lot more effort. You need to look perfect on your wedding. It's all for her own good. And so a classic manipulation scheme was revealed. Using both carrot and stick, Gerald quickly dominated minds. Hiding behind glasses and a sweet smile, Gerald only showed her true character with her father. She threw a tantrum at him about having to teach a mongrel girl. However, Cedric's order could not be disobeyed. Moreover, the parents still wanted to make the girl an archduchess, so Gerald must moderate her temper and do whatever is required. Even if it means teaching a commoner. We just need to wait a little, and they will drive Caleb out of the duchy, and all power will be in the hands of their family. The main thing is that the newlywed bride doesn't find out what Gerald is doing with Caleb. The boy cannot trust her completely. Too little time has passed. The teacher won the young duke's trust long and hard. Elijah will have to be tactfully put in her place and instilled with self-doubt. Finally, her father advised Gerald to simply be his ideal daughter. The girl simply borrowed her manipulative scheme from her family. However, Elia saw through the scheme in no time. She told the teacher that she had already spoken to Cedric. She said that a commoner is not a match for such a high-born man. Gerald squinted, and Elia continued to describe Cedric's answer in vivid detail, about how the man doesn't care about Elia's origins and skills, that he just loves her as she is, clumsy, and he doesn't care about her imperfect gait and manners. Therefore, Cedric will not be disappointed, even if Elia does not succeed in something. Gerald quickly pulled herself together and confirmed that it was a beautiful love story. But the teacher's entire plan fell apart. Elijah was unmoved. It's good that Caleb was reading a book all this time and didn't hear their conversation. Thus, the work on the gate was completed. Elia was already mentally celebrating the victory, but Gerald was not so simple. She suggested moving on to an in-depth study. The teacher's sweet face now exuded coldness and menace. She brought new shoes for Elia. The gate had to be practiced in huge heels. After all, a lady should be able to look elegant in absolutely any outfit. With a heavy heart, Elia agreed. The shoes were uncomfortable, and it was only possible to move slowly and carefully. Noticing this, Gerald immediately suggested trying to walk a little faster. Gritting her teeth, Elia sped up. The heel of the right shoe broke with a crack. Even Caleb turned around at the sound, tearing himself away from his book. Elia collapsed to the floor, twisting her ankle. Gerald immediately started running around, lamenting. Elijah was twisted with anger. The girl tried her best to hide her emotions, while the teacher was making false apologies. However, the maid was preparing the shoes for Elia. So now Gerald is obliged to personally punish the servants. The bride's health was put at risk. Caleb rushed towards the girl, still sitting on the floor. He thoughtfully offered to finish the lesson and treat the wound. Gerald began to hastily agree with the boy. This way, she will be able to ignore Elia's objections and punish Olivia with authority, thus causing Elia even more pain. Gerald was really smart. Elia needed a new plan. Caleb invited the doctor to the girl's chambers. The bones were intact. She only scratched her foot. The doctor prescribed ointment and dressings. Caleb continued to fuss around the girl. Suddenly, the boy became sad. It turns out he was supposed to return to class. Thus, the cunning Gerald neutralized Elia, and again I was able to be alone with Caleb. The boy left, promising to return immediately after school. As soon as the doors to Elia's chambers closed, Caleb was overcome with melancholy. The burden that only Elia had lifted fell back onto the children's shoulders. The child shuffled off to class. Olivia continued to take care of Elia. The girls laughed merrily, remembering how Caleb tried to carry Elia. Olivia sternly ordered Elia to rest. She was not allowed to stand up or strain her leg. It was necessary to get well as soon as possible. Left alone, the girl thoughtfully examined the bandage on her leg. The original plan went to hell. All that was left was to tell Cedric everything. Gerald was born into a very wealthy family. She was used to having all her wishes fulfilled at the snap of a finger, and still continues to want more. Their entire family organized one big conspiracy. Something had to be done, and quickly. Elia called out to Olivia decisively, and she asked to bring the etiquette teacher to her. Gerald, who entered, predictably feigned sympathy. Elia decisively sent Olivia away, leaving her alone with the teacher. First of all, Elia demanded that the maid not be punished. Gerald had to agree. Of course, she immediately admitted that Elia was a real angel, and she should learn to treat the servants more strictly. Elia answered directly that it was not the maid who broke her heel. Gerald broke her heel, and it would be good for her to stop this performance. The etiquette teacher's eyes flashed angrily, so the masks were dropped. Gerald stated outright that Elia was a nobody. The real power in the duchy belongs to the Marquis's family. Elia tried to appeal to Gerald's feelings. Let him at least not cripple the child. But for Gerald, Caleb was only an obstacle on the path to power. According to the teacher, Elia's trying in vain. She only knew Caleb about a week ago. She won't be able to ruin the plan. Elia must understand that all her efforts are in vain. Yes, Elia and Caleb only spent a week together, but the girl had all the knowledge of another world on her side, and also knowledge of the whole story described in the novel. Elia knows almost everything about Caleb. One can only marvel at the strength of a child who is able to survive in such conditions. Elia raised her head resolutely and met Gerald's gaze. Even though Elia had hoped to leave the duchy soon, she would not do so until she had escaped from Gerald Castle. Elia gave the teacher a haughty look, and then she began to laugh loudly. Gerald's eyes widened at the audacity. Elia, meanwhile, noted that the etiquette teacher looked simply disgusting, and she laughed again, not even hiding her contempt. It's time to pay the manipulator back in the same coin. Gerald lost her composure and called Elia a homeless girl. Elia feigned fear and asked if it was appropriate for an etiquette teacher to use such language. Perhaps Gerald didn't do well at the academy, since she still can't control herself. After all, what distinguishes a true aristocrat is endurance in any circumstances. Gerald's ears seemed to steam with rage. Beside herself with anger, the teacher swung her arm to hit Elia. Trained Elia easily intercepted her hand. Gerald felt uneasy at Elia's strength. The teacher's hand felt as if it were in a vice. Elia calmly asked if the teacher really wanted to resolve the issue with violence, and she warned Gerald to stop carrying out her father's plans. Elia will no longer allow the use of Caleb. Just at that moment, a boy's voice was heard from the corridor. Both girls froze, never letting go of each other. The young duke entered, accompanied by his elder brother and his advisor, Edwin. Gerald quickly jumped away from Elia and curtsied gracefully to Cedric. Of course, according to the teacher, it was Elia who grabbed her without any reason and caused her severe pain. Caleb abruptly interrupted Gerald's stream of lamentations, and he informed the teacher that she no longer worked there and had to leave the duchy right now. A shocked Elia looked at Caleb, whose eyes sparkled with rage. The teacher, now a former one, was completely speechless. The suddenness of the situation caused Gerald's false pious facade to completely fall away. She started shouting at the young duke. Caleb raised his eyebrows in mock surprise, and then he began to take off his gloves with a theatrical gesture, saying that he did not understand the reasons for Gerald's surprise. After all, she knows better than anyone why this decision is balanced and justified. The boy stretched out his palms in front of him, bearing marks from blows from the rod, and he demanded that Gerald leave the duchy immediately. Gerald turned decisively to Cedric, apparently assuming that the man would stand up for her. She talked fussily about how corporal punishment was necessary at Caleb's age for successful learning. Elia intervened, noting that violence should not be used against children under any circumstances. There is no and cannot be any justification for the actions of the former teacher. Gerald countered that Elia was not a member of the aristocracy, and their methods of upbringing might not be entirely clear to her. It was Elia's turn to seethe with anger. Suddenly, the girl felt Cedric put his arm around her shoulders, quietly approaching from behind. At the same time, the man raised his hand, stopping the flow of excuses from Gerald. Cedric's voice was calm and cold, but the man's eyes were flashing. He ordered Gerald to leave immediately. Her behavior would be discussed personally with the Marquis of Babylon, her father. However, Gerald was unmoved. She demanded proof that Caleb's wounds were inflicted on her. There is also no direct evidence to indicate that it was Gerald who broke Elia's heel. Elia whistled inwardly at such impudence. The former teacher's tension was only revealed by her hands, clutching the hem of her dress. Edwin stepped forward, holding a blue sphere from which Gerald's voice was emanating. She was clearly scolding Caleb for not being able to solve the problem. She said he needed to work harder to become an archduke. She stated that Cedric would be very disappointed in the boy because Caleb wasn't trying hard enough. After all, if the older brother sees some kind of shortcoming, the child will have big problems. A small image also flickered above the sphere, clearly demonstrating the etiquette lessons that had been taught. Meanwhile, the broadcast continued. Gerald was telling the boy not to dare tell anyone about the lessons. Otherwise, all his close people will become disappointed and abandon him. All this is only for the good of Caleb, because this is exactly the path of the future archduke. Caleb recalled a warm conversation with Elia in the park. He so wanted to believe the girl then. But something inside prevented him from completely rejecting Gerald's instructions, and only when Elia got hurt, it was as if Caleb's eyes opened. He was willing to endure his own pain forever, but not Elia's pain, and so he went to Cedric. Of course, it was not easy for the boy to admit what he thought was his own weakness. Caleb could literally physically feel Gerald's hands and her whispers that Cedric would be disappointed. But for Elia's sake, the child was ready to risk everything, even the respect of his brother. Obsessed with his thoughts, Caleb did not notice how Cedric approached the shaking child and threw a blanket over him. The condition of the youngest seriously worried Cedric. Yes, the elder did not know how to express his feelings, but he always saw when the situation became critical. The child, frozen in a stupor, slowly warmed up. Cedric shouted for more blankets, and the sound of his voice was what brought Caleb out of his stupor. The boy remembered how warm it was for him in Elia's house, and how caring Cedric rushed to save him, ready to risk everything. Then Caleb calmly told and showed the recording to his older brother. Cedric took immediate action, and finally, both he and Elia were safe. Caleb had a feeling that as long as Elia's arms were around him, everything would be fine. And now Cedric was nearby, who, as it turned out, loved him. Gerald suddenly seemed so small and weak to Caleb. The former etiquette teacher, meanwhile, still couldn't come to terms with what was happening. She shouted about her high birth and excellent grades. "You simply can't treat her like that, the Marquis's daughter." Cedric's voice dropped another couple of tones. Gravity magic flickered at the angry man's fingertips. It is unknown what he would have done with Gerald if not for Caleb, who took his older brother by the hand. A joyful Caleb said that he was really okay now. Cedric shouldn't get his hands dirty with his former teacher. The man exhaled and decided to beat Gerald at her own game. He agreed that the Marquis of Babylon's family was the most respected in the duchy, and if so, they should be an example to follow for all vassals. This means that Gerald's shame must be told not only to her father, but to the entire duchy. After which, Cedric asked advisor Edwin to take Gerald out of the room. The former teacher's face reflected a complex mixture of anger and despair. Cedric just promised to bury the reputation of the Babylon family. And Gerald knows exactly who caused this. The homeless girl Elia, who appeared and ruined all the plans. Finally, Gerald was taken out of the room and it was all over. True, Elia still felt goosebumps from the burning gaze of her former teacher. The unpleasant feeling was interrupted by Cedric's voice. The man thanked Elia for her concern. The girl was able to stop the cycle of violence against the child. It also helped to strengthen trust between the brothers. Perhaps, without her intervention, the situation could have become truly critical. Cedric couldn't forgive himself for remaining in the dark for so many years. And all this time, his younger brother suffered. A surprised Elia looked at Cedric, who was showing emotions so openly for the first time. The man squeezed Caleb's hand carefully. It seemed like they had finally had a calm conversation, and Cedric began to take care of the little one. Cedric also felt it necessary to apologize to Elia. He allowed himself to be very rude by hugging her without permission, but he did this only to demonstrate Elia's importance to Gerald. Of course, any further physical contact will only be carried out with the girl's consent. Caleb smiled joyfully. For the first time since moving to the castle, the boy looked carefree. Unable to contain herself, Elia stroked the child's head. It seemed that Caleb heard her and began to believe in himself. He will make a fine archduke. If only Elia could bring back the fairy's memories, she would help Cedric too. The man was just saying goodbye to Elia, saying that he needed to get back to business. However, having already turned around, Cedric froze and then resolutely returned to the girl. Embarrassed and with his head down, the man muttered words of apology, and then he took a strand of Elia's hair, and bending down, he brought it to his nose. The bewildered girl didn't even know what to say or do. Cedric straightened up and explained that he needed to check something. He smelled a pleasant scent of perfume coming from Elia, but the girl replied that she doesn't use perfume. Cedric, completely embarrassed, hurried away. Elia continued to admire Caleb, who also touched her long hair. He looked so much like Yoon. In the same way, in the hospital, her brother sniffed her hair, which smelled of deodorant. Elia smiled tenderly and invited the three brothers to have dinner together. Meanwhile, the Babylon family's carriage was taking Jareel away from the duchy. The irritated girl literally bit her hands, trying to understand where she had gone wrong. Cedric simply couldn't fall in love with a commoner. The homeless girl, because of whom Gerald has now lost everything. The girl promised herself that she would definitely take revenge on Elia. At the next council, Cedric raised the issue of exiling the entire family of Marquis Renaud of Babylon. Of course, the families bribed by the Marquis insisted on giving Jareel another chance. However, the vassals whom the Marquis had oppressed also decided not to miss the opportunity and insisted on expulsion. Cedric looked calmly at the screaming people, but irritation raged inside him. The sight was truly disgusting. It was good that Caleb did not see it. It was impossible to get rid of the machinations of the Babylon family at once, but a start had been made. The main thing now is to act smartly and consistently. Caleb's suffering must not be repeated. Late at night, the Babylon family gathered for a family council. Gerald and her mother waited anxiously for news from the Marquise. The complete expulsion of the family was avoided. Now you need to express gratitude, and then lie low and file an appeal. They are blood relatives of the former Archduchess, and, unless expulsion is involved, they are obliged to be looked after. Cedric will be required to consider the appeal. However, a few days later, the letter sent by the Marquis was returned unopened. The messenger said that Cedric saw the Babylon family seal and did not even try to open it. The Marquise felt a mixture of anger and despair. It was at this moment that another envoy brought a reply letter from the duchy. It stated that the entire Babylon family was forbidden to leave their own estate for 15 days. They should use this time to reflect on their behavior and should be grateful that the deadline has not been extended to a month. Reynolds, in a fit of rage, tore up the letter, scattering pieces all over the office. Hearing the screams, Gerald and his mother came running, but the Marquise continued to rage. He shouted that he was a true aristocrat and the heir to the duchy through the female line. He will not rest until he takes revenge on the homeless girl and the adopted bastard. A week after Gerald was fired, the atmosphere in the duchy changed completely. Elia often walked with Olivia. The girls walked in the garden and laughed a lot. During one of these walks, Elia noticed Caleb on the street. The boy talked to his new teachers. Even from a distance, one could hear the child's laughter. The conversation was clearly very pleasant. Olivia also noticed that the young duke had become more joyful and open. Caleb discussed the books he had read with his new teachers with obvious pleasure. The conversation flowed easily. Elia's eyes lit up with happiness. Finally, the boy stopped suffering. After saying goodbye to Olivia in the corridor, Elia headed to her chambers, still thinking about Caleb. When they first met, the boy resembled Cedric. He was withdrawn, reserved, and said nothing about his pain. Perhaps the brothers have much more in common than it might seem at first. Elia still knows very little about Cedric, only the bits and pieces that Caleb told her. Cedric rarely talks about himself, but so does Elia, because she has a terrible secret. However, this is not a reason to continue to keep our distance. We will need to share stories from our lives. Without further ado, Elia decided to go straight to Cedric's and have lunch together. But the ever-busy Cedric quickly turned the conversation to something more concrete, a discussion of wedding dresses. As expected, the man made a decision quite quickly, having barely glanced at the models. Elijah was not very interested in clothes, but she was interested in food. It turns out that one of the Empire's traditions was to set the table with the newlyweds' favorite dishes. Finding out Cedric's favorite food is a great start to getting to know him. But the man simply replied that he didn't care, and that Elia could choose dishes to her taste. The girl tried to persuade Cedric to share, because eating delicious food together is fun. The man looked up sadly and replied that it was too late. All 5 of his senses are gradually atrophying due to the curse. Elia couldn't believe her ears. Cedric gradually fell into an eternal sleep, all his senses becoming duller with each passing day. He doesn't like eating food because he has no sense of smell or taste. Elia could hardly hold back her tears and her hands trembling. Yes, that's exactly how it was described in the novel. First, the curse took away the sense of smell and taste, and then touch, hearing, and sight. The curse of eternal sleep. You are not dead, but nothing in the world can wake you up. If the girl got the chronology right, by this point in the novel, Cedric would already be losing his sense of touch. It turns out that for some reason the curse develops more slowly, but the man still no longer feels the taste. Cedric, meanwhile, watched in shock at the undisguised sorrow on Elia's face. And then the girl remembered that Cedric had recently asked her about perfume. The man has lost his sense of smell, but for some reason, he can smell a floral scent coming from Elia. No other aromas or tastes, even the strongest ones, can penetrate. Cedric hasn't found the reason for this yet. Even now, the man doesn't smell the tea or bread at all, but he clearly senses Elia's scent. Cedric's cold eyes pierced Elia, hoping to find an answer. The problem is that it's most likely because Elia cast a curse. A sharp strike of lightning broke the tense silence. The friends turned to the window in bewilderment as a sudden downpour began outside. It was absolutely impossible. Cedric, as a weather mage, had complete control over the weather in the duchy, but the fact remains that it was pouring rain outside the window, against the man's will. Caleb burst into Cedric's office with joyful cries. The boy remembered how at Elia's house, the girl cooked him potato pancakes when it started raining, and it was impossible to go for a walk. So now it's raining. The boy really asks Elia to repeat the dish. Elia wondered where she could get potatoes in the huge castle. A few minutes ago, Caleb was sitting in his study hall. He had just finished reading a very interesting book that his new teacher had given him. The book was read in one go, earlier than Caleb had planned. The boy really wanted to go for a walk with Elia, but she was busy preparing for the wedding. In general, the friends had seen each other very little lately, because the girl wanted to improve her relationship with Cedric. A saddened Caleb remembered how they ate together at Elia's house. The boy liked it most when the girl cooked potato pancakes. I remember Elia telling me that she always made them for someone when it rained. However, the girl said that she had lost her memory. It turns out that she should not remember anything about herself or her relatives. Perhaps cooking helps bring back memories. But when Elia remembers everything, she can leave the duchy and go to her home. The boy became so sad that he didn't even notice how it started to rain, and he didn't even realize that he himself had summoned it, interrupting his brother's magic. A stunned Cedric looked out the window at the rain. Caleb continued to persuade the girl to cook him potato pancakes. Elia happily agreed to demonstrate her culinary skills. The young duke persuaded his elder brother to go with them. After all, lately the man has had no appetite at all. Thus, Elia realized that Caleb knew nothing about the symptoms of his older brother's curse. None of them wanted to worry the child who had so suddenly discovered a new magical power within himself. To the soothing sound of the rain, the friends went to the kitchen. The fragrant smell of potato pancakes filled the kitchen. Edwin volunteered to help Elia, while the others sat down at the table, waiting for refreshments. Edwin thoughtfully remarked that potato pancakes were not the healthiest food because they were cooked with a lot of oil. Elia laughed and replied that it was a holiday food, and sometimes you could indulge in something unhealthy. When pancakes are deep-fried, their edges become deliciously crispy. Elia thought that Edwin would be upset that the girl had taken his place at the stove from him, but the man simply watched closely and actually helped, listening carefully to what Elia was saying. The result was not long in coming. A mountain of delicious-smelling potato pancakes was already on the table in front of the brothers. Caleb noticed that this time, the potato pancakes turned out to be a different shape but no less tasty. Elia replied that this time she decided to try a different recipe, with sauce. The boy sucked on the fork with pleasure. The potato pancakes really turned out delicious. To the delighted cries of Caleb, everyone else also pounced on the food. Noticing that his older brother was the only one who wasn't eating, the boy began to persuade him to try. Cedric looked sadly at the potato pancake on his fork, knowing he wouldn't taste it. Knowing about the man's problem, Elia quietly whispered that he didn't have to force himself. She and everyone else just enjoy spending time in Cedric's company. The man quietly replied that he was used to this and put the potato pancake in his mouth. Elia looked at Cedric with pain in her eyes, struggling with the feeling of guilt inside her. It was necessary to deal with the fairy's magic and lift the curse as quickly as possible. Suddenly, the man's face twisted into a grimace. The fork flew to the floor. Cedric bent over the table as if in pain. Elia and everyone present rushed towards him. Not understanding what was happening, Cedric sat with his head in his hands, clearly struggling with something within himself. Edwin shouted that it was poison, but Caleb immediately stopped the advisor, noting that he himself was fine. Elia didn't understand what was happening. She had just baked potato pancakes as usual. Cedric decisively interrupted Edwin's screams, who was already calling for a doctor. The man said they had all misunderstood and that he was fine. There was no poison. It was a reaction of pleasure, not pain. The thing is, for the first time in a long time, Cedric felt the taste of food. Stunned, Elia didn't know where to look. Caleb was also shocked, but for a different reason. He was hearing about the symptoms of his brother's curse for the first time. The curse is gaining momentum, and time is running out. Cedric apologized to Caleb. Of course, he should have told him earlier. Caleb understood that the reason was that Cedric cared for the youngest, and not at all because of mistrust. Elia stood between them, knowing that Cedric could taste it because it was the girl who had prepared the food. Now the brothers are completely focused on expressing their own feelings and strengthening mutual understanding. But soon, Cedric will put all the facts together and realize that it was Elia who cursed him. However, the question of why everything happened right now was asked by Caleb. Cedric muttered that it might be an accident and that he needed to calmly examine all the symptoms again. The man really can reveal Elia's secret, and it's quite possible that he already has. But it doesn't matter. Only she is the key to lifting the curse, which means Cedric will remain silent. It was at that moment that the man shouted loudly at Elijah. The girl jumped up, but Cedric only asked her to make him more. The usually strong and reserved man looked so cute with an empty plate in his hands. Everyone else also perked up and started asking for more. Elia went to cook more. The friends finished feasting late at night. Tired, Elia went to her chambers to take a bath before bed. The girl lay there and thought that she was very tired because she had to keep so many secrets to herself. At that moment, the door slammed and Olivia entered with a stack of towels. No matter how much Elia didn't trust the woman, she immediately straightened up and sat up straighter. Elia began to thank Olivia for always helping her with both everyday life and etiquette. But Olivia replied that she should be the one thanking him. With Elia's arrival, the atmosphere in the duchy had improved significantly. Elia remembered that when she first arrived, she was struck by the empty corridor and the dead silence throughout the castle. Olivia said that it was with Elia's arrival that the castle was filled with warmth and laughter. The woman was also very impressed that the brothers had become closer and started talking about their feelings. And Elia did all this. Caleb's changes are more noticeable, but Olivia thinks Cedric has changed too. The man's expression became softer. Today he smiled for the first time in a very long time. After this, Olivia began to describe the magical power of love. Not knowing that this was a contract marriage, Elia looked at the maid with emotion, thinking that she was only trying to correct the actions of her predecessor. Every day, it becomes more and more difficult for the girl to smile, because the main problem is in her. She cursed Cedric. She has no idea how to fix it. Olivia finally left the room, and Elia leaned back tiredly against the bathtub. At least she could cook Cedric his favorite meals sometimes, until she figured out how to break the curse. I hope he doesn't figure it out, or at least doesn't take any action against her in the near future. After dinner, Cedric headed to his office as usual. He still had unfinished business, but his mind did not want to focus on work. Time and again, Cedric thought about the situation with Elia, wondering who she could have been in the past. There was another moment to reflect on. The rain, which had started so suddenly, also stopped just as suddenly. It was undoubtedly Caleb's doing. The boy, consciously or not, used weather magic, one of the greatest lost abilities in all the ages of this world's existence. This means that the younger brother has colossal magical potential. Many have tried to revive weather magic over the centuries, but no one has succeeded until Cedric. The man succeeded in it when he was only 18. Cedric tried to teach this magic to Caleb. The older brother was completely confident that the boy was capable of this, but Caleb didn't believe in himself. He thought that he didn't have as much magic. He wasn't as great as Cedric. The boy perceived every failure as a reason why his older brother should turn away from him. Eventually, Cedric gave in and their lessons stopped. However, today's thunderstorm was undoubtedly caused by Caleb. If you think about it, it looked very strange. Caleb had become adept at weather magic despite his hands still not healing, all after his encounter with Elia. Cedric could not find any information about the girl herself or her past. The aroma that a man could only smell from Elia, and now the taste of the food she had prepared. It was all strange. Her appearance clearly indicates that Elia is a pure-blooded fairy. But, apart from this, it is impossible to find out absolutely anything, and this is frightening. The next morning again greeted Elia with bright sunshine. Looking out the window, the girl once again admired the beauty of the castle grounds. Today, she had lunch with her brothers. She needed to choose a meeting place and prepare everything. Once again, the girl began to remember the novel, trying to find her place in this new magical world. The last few days have been busy and challenging, and even though the wedding date has now been set and everything is going smoothly, one should not forget the true purpose of her arrival in the duchy. If Elia manages to overcome Cedric's curse, and Caleb does not fall into darkness, the future of the novel's protagonist, Daphne Marinest, will change irreversibly. There will be no conflict between the imperial family and the Duchy of Indigentia. Events will develop in a new, unpredictable way, and Elia will no longer be able to do anything. The same bright sun illuminated the emperor's palace at the same time. Daphne Marinest was having breakfast in the garden with the prince. She was now about 6 years old, with charming blue curls scattered over her dress. Prince Renoa was completely enchanted, and he constantly spoke of this with childish spontaneity. The boy was an open and sincere child, suffering from loneliness and the demands placed on him as the heir to the throne. Daphne laughed merrily and replied that the prince was also especially magnificent today. The young duchess looked like a beautiful pond illuminated by the summer sun. The children were already finishing drinking tea. Suddenly, Renoa gracefully picked up and kissed a strand of Daphne's hair. The young prince's manners were impeccable, but a barely noticeable melancholy appeared in the girl's eyes. The appearance of the servant helped Daphne hide it. Renoa was summoned by his father. The boy hurried to the emperor, and the duchess promised to wait for him here. As soon as Renoa left the gazebo, Daphne breathed a sigh of relief. She knew she shouldn't complain. The girl was truly happy now, but she was dead tired of pretending to be a child. The novel's main character managed to return to the past during her tragic death at the age of 16. Before returning to the original timeline, Daphne had been unable to use magic since childhood. As a result of the return, a situation arose where yesterday the child could not do anything, but today he was already performing serious spells. All the vassals of the Marinus Duchy regarded Daphne with suspicion. Daphne's father, of course, put the particularly presumptuous ones in their place, but the gossip continued anyway. For some reason, in the original past, her father, Calvados Marinest, did not teach his daughter any magic. He had no expectations or demands of Daphne. However, her own incompetence and the wave of hatred that fell upon her from her vassals made the girl very unhappy. The turning point came at a banquet in honor of Prince Renoa's birthday, when Daphne was already about 16. All the guests were dancing, smiling, and seemed very happy. At some point, the prince went out onto the terrace to get some air. It was then that the fairy in the black robe appeared. Without saying a word, the fairy cast a curse on Renoa. Daphne, who was nearby, was accused of failing to protect the imperial family, and as punishment, the girl was imprisoned, where she was to be executed after reaching adulthood. During the first months of her imprisonment, Daphne was frequently visited by her father's vassals. They mocked the girl's naivety. They said that all this time they had been kind to her and tried to maintain good relations. And she, Daphne, turned out to be useless at the critical moment. Because of her, the entire Duchy of Marinist is in disgrace. The girl was methodically told that everything that happened was her fault. One day, when the day of execution was already approaching, her father came to her cell. Calvado said she should run right now. The man's face was distorted with unusual tenderness and pain. Without wasting any time, the father told how to get out of the castle through the drain. The daughter had to flee the empire as quickly and as far as she could. Father made sure that there were no guards on the way. Calvados himself planned to stay here and accept Daphne's punishment. He admitted that all this time, he loved his daughter very much, and he simply wanted her to be happy without the burden of inheriting a title and any expectations from vassals. It doesn't matter whether Daphne can use magic or not. Let her live freely, doing as her heart desires. The girl ran through the forest, choked by tears. All this time, her father loved her and did more for her than for any heir in the entire empire. The girl remembered that night forever, the night she simultaneously found and lost her father. She ran under the howling of wolves, branches whipping her face and legs, without the slightest idea of how she would live on. However, Daphne didn't get far. Very soon, she heard the sound of pursuit behind her. The memory of this sent a chill through the 6-year-old girl. She really tried to run away, tried to make sure that her father's efforts were not in vain. But the girl found herself alone in the forest for the first time. In a panic, she ran to the edge of the cliff, and the people pursuing her were already pressing from behind. Daphne herself didn't notice how her feet slipped off the edge. At that moment, the girl thought that everything was over, and death had overtaken her. But somehow, inexplicably, she returned to the past and was reborn into the body of her 6-year-old self. The only goal of Daphne's new life was to prevent a fairy attack at the banquet in honor of her 16th birthday, or somehow completely exclude the imperial family from your life. However, this time, the fairy somehow appeared 10 years earlier. Somehow, Daphne managed to use mirror shield magic, which she had never learned before. This magic creates a shield made of mirrors that reflects any other magic and curses. It was also the only magic that could stop the fairies. 200 years ago, the empire was led by fairies, but the current Ipercent family came to power through a rebellion. They were able to defeat the fairies precisely because they had mastered the magic of the mirror shield. Everyone was incredibly surprised to see that 6-year-old Daphne could do such magic. However, the Marinist ducal line originates from a collateral line of the Ipercent family. Also, in her past life, Daphne studied a lot of books, even though she couldn't use magic. The vassals calmed down, but the girl herself had no fewer questions. After the rescue, Prince Renoa became the girl's constant companion, and now he was already returning to the girl, but only to inform her that he would be too busy today. After using the mirror shield magic, Daphne was initially entrusted with teaching the prince spells. Every time he couldn't believe that his peer was so skilled in magic, Daphne knew that even without her, at the age of 10, the prince would have entered the Temple of Knowledge and would have successfully studied with his own father. However, the girl could not help but notice the wariness with which the other members of the imperial family interacted with her. Most likely, they are afraid that she will claim the throne since she has the magic of the mirror shield. On the way from the imperial palace to the duchy, the nanny, as usual, gave the girl a fresh newspaper. The girl began reading newspapers to keep track of what changes had occurred in this timeline. She was attracted by a note about the Duchy of Indigentia. There was a lot of attention on them now because of Cedric's marriage and the incident with Gerald. Cedric's bride had a ridiculous expression on her face in the photograph, not typical of aristocrats. She was clearly a commoner, but that wasn't what attracted Daphne. Silver hair that fades to pink and eyes like gemstones. Cedric's bride was clearly a purebred fairy. Somehow, while Daphne was blocking one curse, Cedric was hit by another. The girl felt very sorry, but she couldn't help. Suddenly, some sounds were heard outside the window. Out of the corner of her eye, Daphne noticed a blurry figure. The fairy in the black cloak looked straight at the girl. Daphne, stunned, was unable to move or utter a word. The fairy stretched out her hand forward and cast a spell. The world around Daphne was drowned in a flash of bright light. At the same time, in the Duchy of Indigentia, friends were dining together. Happy Khalib laughed merrily and talked about his activities. Elia cooked the food, so Cedric could taste it, and was also incredibly happy. Elia, although tired, also felt happy, and even as if she was in the family circle. The girl liked to see the man so relaxed and contented. Perhaps it wasn't just the food. Cedric had truly changed, and even though Elia can't yet lift the curse, she will at least give her brothers moments of joy like these. Lunch was interrupted by Edwin with an urgent message. The advisor looked very worried. Elia watched with alarm as he walked across the hall directly to Cedric. Breaking news from the Imperial Palace. Princess Marinist was kidnapped right from under the noses of the Imperial Guards. Fairies are suspected. Cedric's suppressed concern was interrupted by Elia's surprised cry. Everyone turned to the girl in surprise. Elia shouldn't even know who Daphne was. An embarrassed Elia quickly justified her reaction by saying that she was outraged that anyone had been kidnapped at all. At the same time, the girl thought that the events were very similar to those in the original story. But it was she, Elia, who was supposed to try to kidnap Daphne, after which the fairy was captured by the Emperor's forces, and she mysteriously died in prison. But it is unclear who kidnapped Daphne now, and why this someone succeeded. If the girl was reborn in the original story, it turns out that she is not Elia. Then the first mystery is who the girl was lucky enough to become after being reborn. And the second is, how is it possible that two characters have such similar appearances? Perhaps the answer was hidden in one of the hints in the novel. The author hinted that the fairy might have had a twin sister, but if that's really the case, Elia will never be able to lift the curse from Cedric. All this time, the man watched the changes in the girl's face. Finally, he asked if everything was okay with her. Elia had no choice but to quickly change the subject to Daphne's kidnapping. She wants to know all the details and help in any way she can. Edwin said that the girl was kidnapped right from her carriage, on the way to the Duchy of Marinist. Khalib looked at the man thoughtfully, clearly remembering his incident. The exact location of the abduction has not yet been determined. A haughty expression suddenly appeared on the young duke's face, and he asked why, exactly, his older brother should deal with this. Elia was struck by the child's sudden change in mood, although his reaction is understandable. After all, thanks to Daphne, the prince escaped the curse, but Cedric fell under it. After the incident, Duke Marinest sent out a request to everyone for help in finding his daughter. However, no request was received in Indigentia, perhaps because gravity magic would not have helped. Family magic can only be used by a family member. It is a kind of symbol. Some families can transform into dogs or work with the human psyche. They can be useful in the investigation. However, Marinest sent requests to absolutely everyone except Indigentia, including the Duchy of Maishalat. Maishalat is the third equal duchy in the empire. They specialize in interacting with material objects. They can also enter the Temple of Knowledge and possess considerable power and influence. The temple is where one can learn the secrets of each family, so all the duchies try to maintain balance and not interfere in each other's problems. The fact that Maishalat has united with Marinest significantly undermines this balance. Cedric didn't move, but his eyes flashed. Waves of heavy dark energy emanated from the man. It was necessary to check whether Maishalat had actually responded to the call. Indigentia has always maintained good relations with Marinest. Despite the curse that befell him, Cedric did not ask for compensation from the imperial family. However, none of them approached Indigenia directly. So Marinest has something to hide. We need to send people to the Empire right now and discreetly sort out the situation. Elia looked at the embittered Cedric, and her heart felt that she should not act like that. Spying on Marinest and the imperial family will lead to nothing good. Edwin had already bowed and went to carry out the order, but he was stopped by Elia's shout. She asked Cedric to listen to her words and act more openly. There is no need to weave any secret conspiracies in response. The four of them will go to the capital and take control of the situation. Cedric looked at his bride doubtfully. Elia continued to emotionally prove that they would be able to find Daphne and fix the situation. She silently prayed that she would have enough words to convince Cedric. She knows the original story. Whoever kidnapped Daphne could be the real key to breaking Cedric's curse. It was this argument that became decisive for the man. They will be able to not only help Marinest and strengthen their position, but also heal Cedric. They must all go to the capital together. The journey through the sun-drenched forest did not take much time. Soon they were already in the very heart of the empire. Cedric still insisted that they dress like ordinary aristocrats. So now Cedric, Elia, and Caleb resembled an ordinary young married couple with a child. Elia's face lit up with determination. She had to figure out the situation. A few hours ago, Olivia was helping a girl urgently pack her things. The maid was very upset that she could not go with her mistress. However, Cedric insisted on maximum secrecy for the operation. The three of them would be more than enough. Olivia was very worried about the girl, but she didn't know what Elia knew. After all, Cedric was the most powerful magician of our time, and Caleb will become the most powerful in the future. Olivia, although still worried, remembered one incident. One day she overheard gossip from other maids. They called Lady Elia a lowly commoner. They also went over Olivia herself, saying that serving a low-born woman is also a disgrace. It was at this moment that Lady Elia appeared. Pretending not to have heard anything, she offered the maid her help in carrying the groceries. The girl, as always, was cheerful and peace-loving. The maids began to make excuses. The food really was very heavy. Moreover, the mistress should not help the servants. However, without listening to them, Elia picked up a huge box of tomatoes and effortlessly lifted it onto one shoulder, after which, with a touch of sarcasm, she remarked that this was the only thing she could carry with just her thin hand. Surely maids can wear even more. The maids couldn't find anything to say, and they didn't dare object when Elia forced them to work and carry much heavier products. Elia's voice brought Olivia out of her memories. The lady is certainly very strong, but she must take care of herself. The sunny capital was beautiful. However, people on the streets looked worried, as if they were afraid of something. The people there were mostly aristocrats and wealthy townspeople, judging by their clothes. Elia turned to the young couple, who seemed to her to be as harmless as possible. The girl explained that she and her family wanted to have some fun and did not understand why the atmosphere was so oppressive. The boy and girl, having learned that their friends had not heard the rumors, began to tell them enthusiastically. Over the next half hour, Elia was bombarded with information, much of which she already knew. The couple was literally unstoppable. Of course, they mainly talked about Daphne's kidnapping. Having had a hard time getting rid of their new acquaintances, the friends continued their journey through the streets of the capital. Elia looked at the shining Caleb with surprise. The boy sincerely enjoyed the walk with his beloved brother and Elia. Surely they had already been here with Cedric, and it would have been possible to arrange a tour if not for the circumstances. They must find the kidnapped Daphne as quickly as possible. Elia must understand whether she is the main culprit of the events taking place. It was necessary to identify all the details that differ from the version of the novel that was read. In the original, the fairy cast a spell on Prince Renoa when he was 16 years old. However, the reason why the fairy appeared 10 years earlier, after Daphne's return, is not clear. Some of this may not have happened in the original story where Elia ended up. Or perhaps, Elia herself was the reason for the change in the original story. Cedric, meanwhile, warned that he was seeing more and more Imperial Knights, and it would be good to get off the main street. The friends headed towards residential areas. Initially, it was necessary to collect as much information as possible about the abduction. However, after a few hours, the friends sat down tiredly on a nearby bench. So far, none of their actions have been successful. After resting, Elia and the brothers headed to the nearest park. Unlike the other streets, peace and tranquility reigned here. Children ran and played. Adults walked calmly with smiles on their faces. Elia's thoughts naturally flew towards the future, when they would lift the curse from Cedric and live just as peacefully. All this time, Cedric was secretly watching Elia. At first, her emotional reaction to the kidnapping was unfounded. Then, a desperate, persistent desire to join in the search for Daphne. Elia acts like she knows something. Cedric's real goal was not to find Daphne Mariniste. The man hoped to learn more about Elia's past while they were in the capital. Suddenly, a loud boyish scream was heard behind them. Some boy was deliberately calling his sister, looking at Elia's back. The girl turned around in fear. But another girl was already walking towards the boy. It looks like he was simply mistaken. Cedric couldn't help but notice the look of relief on Elia's face. Elia, of course, reacted that way, because the boy's voice reminded her of Yoon's voice. An expression of restrained tenderness and deep hidden sadness appeared on the girl's face. Cedric reached out to touch her shoulder. The man himself didn't know whether he wanted to hug the girl or ask her about such an emotional reaction. But at that moment, arrested Elia jumped up, ready to continue the investigation. Cedric had no choice but to hurry after her. The girl called out to Caleb, who moved slightly away from the bench where the friends were sitting. However, the boy did not react, did not even turn around. He continued to stare at something at the other end of the park. Surprised, Elia stood behind the child, trying to follow the direction of his gaze. Caleb was so fascinated by something that he didn't even notice anything. Finally, Elia realized that on the opposite side, a man was selling candy to children. Girls and boys happily bought lemon and honey lollipops. Elia remembered that Caleb really loved both lemons and sweets. Apparently, the boy really wanted a lollipop, but was too shy to ask. Elia was about to buy some candy, but Cedric intervened and pointed out that one shouldn't eat street food carelessly. After all, it could easily be used to poison the young Duke. Cedric continued talking about the trusted dessert shop, but noticed his brother's sadness and gave in. It's unlikely that there's any danger, but the lollipops will help the friends replenish their strength for their mission. So Cedric bought Caleb not one, but 2 lollipops. The child's happiness knew no bounds. The seller himself melted with emotion, watching how Caleb rejoiced at this simple delicacy. The boy didn't notice anything around him, except the long-awaited candy. Elia looked at the seller's emotion with a knowing smile. The lollipop was truly amazing. Caleb devoured both candies, while Cedric and Elia admired him. Now they truly felt like family to each other. The same boy who called Elia sister headed to the counter in the company of his real sister. The child began to persistently demand a lollipop. His sister was clearly hesitating as she counted the money. Finally, she beamed and asked for 1 lollipop. Her brother asked if she would have any, but the girl refused and said that she didn't like sweets. This scene painfully reminded Elia of her own childhood, when they also lacked money. The boy offered to share the candy. The girl insisted that everything was fine and he could eat it all by himself. Without remembering herself, Elia jumped up and headed towards the children. Cedric called out to her in surprise. He, of course, hadn't noticed anything. Elia quickly walked up to the girl and handed her her lollipop. She assured the children that she had already eaten and they could take it. The boy was immediately delighted, but his sister looked wary. As she grew older, she learned to fear adults, especially those who offered something for free. But Elia was so open and sincere that the girl's hands naturally reached out to the treat. She thanked him with confusion and took the candy. The boy continued to wave after Elia for a long time, while his sister dragged him away from the strange lady. As Elia waved back at the children, Cedric watched her with bewilderment. In his world, poverty was commonplace. There is an aristocracy. There are commoners. This has always been and always will be the case. Meanwhile, the seller decided to start a conversation with the nice lady still standing at his counter. He advised Elia to take her family to explore a beautiful square nearby. Elia, taking advantage of the opportunity, started a conversation about how these are troubled times. The man replied that the number of soldiers on the streets had indeed increased. Most likely, this is connected with the kidnapping of young Daphne. Elia asked in surprise how everyone knew about this. The seller told me about a notice board for common people. Apparently, the Marinist family is ready to resort to any help, even if the rumors hit their status. Elia intended to get the friendly salesman to talk even more, but then she was pulled by the hand by the boy whose sister she had just given the lollipop to. He whispered that he had a gift for her. This thing was very important for the child, but for a lollipop, he was ready to share it with her. The boy handed Elia something that he was clutching tightly in his fist. At that very moment, Cedric, worried, decided to approach Elia and find out why she was stuck at the counter. The girl opened her hand and saw a small, disgusting bug. He lay on her back in her palm and moved his paws disgustingly. Unable to contain herself, Elia screamed throughout the park. Cedric rushed towards her. The girl began to turn around and apologize. But at that very moment, the heel treacherously slipped on the cobblestones and Elia began to fall backwards. With a frightened cry, Cedric rushed towards her, while simultaneously using gravity magic. It could have been a beautiful romantic act of caring. However, in practice, Elia simply hung in the air in an awkward position, a few centimeters above the ground. Cedric wiggled his fingers, pushing the girl back into an upright position. A worried Caleb was already running towards Elia. An embarrassed Cedric said that he had used magic unconsciously, afraid that Elia would hurt herself. If they were in another novel, the man would have rushed forward and gracefully caught the falling girl by the waist. Their eyes would meet, she would melt in his arms. But no, Cedric did what Cedric did, thus blowing their cover to the lollipop seller and everyone else who saw the scene. Now it was obvious to everyone that they were dealing with the Indigentia family. Common people read newspapers too, and Elia was just scared of a little bug. The salesman's name was Alonso. and his assistant's name was Jordan. Both men watched Cedric with admiration. The friends were very lucky that other passers-by either didn't notice anything or decided not to interfere. But since they had already been exposed, Elia decided to take advantage of the situation and continue questioning Alonso. Before the bug incident, he started talking about knowing something about Daphne's kidnapping. The man hesitated. It was one thing to gossip with a beautiful stranger, and quite another with an aristocrat, especially from the Indigentia family, especially in the presence of her fiancé. However, there was nowhere to retreat. The man said that he had recently been selling lollipops in another square and overheard a conversation between two customers. The carriage that was returning to the Marinus Duchy from the Imperial Palace disappeared right before their eyes. There was no fight, no attack. The carriage simply disappeared into thin air, and in its place stood a motionless figure in a black robe, which a moment later also dissolved. Elia thought that in the original novel, it was always the fairy who appeared in the black robe. At first, everyone thought that the carriage had simply moved using magic. Who could understand their aristocrats? But rumor has it that kidnapping is a more likely explanation. The shoppers saying this came from the main gate of Elphium Square. They definitely came from the main road, since there is construction going on in that area at the moment. They are widening the paths for magical energy there, so there are few passers-by in that area. The friends had their first real lead. It will also help that the whole situation happened near the paths of magical energy. These paths transmit magic from the Emperor's castle to residential areas. They are formed using special stones that automatically record traces of magic around them. To read these traces and track a person, a high-ranking magician is needed. However, among them, by chance, was the most powerful sorcerer in this world. The only problem was that the entire Elphium Square heard what the seller had just told them. Let's hope no one else noticed. Finally, Cedric asked menacingly whether everything he had told was the pure truth. The sellers immediately began to fall at his feet and swear that they would not dare lie to the formidable aristocrat. Cedric thanked the men for their help and paid generously for the information they received. In the end, the sellers were very pleased with the conversation. It was time to head to the designated place, but Caleb was stuck at the counter again. The lemon drops attracted the child like a magnet. Noticing the boy's sweet face, the seller handed him another candy. Caleb accepted the treat with gratitude, while the seller's partner was scolding Alonso for giving away the goods for free. The second candy went into Caleb's greedy hands. The satisfied boy was fully prepared to continue his investigation. It was literally a 10-minute walk. On the way, Cedric began to ask Elia what she had been talking about with the seller for so long, and why did I laugh so sincerely with him? The perplexed girl honestly explained that Alonso had simply advised them of parks where they could still take a walk. If the girl didn't know Cedric, one might think that he was jealous. But this is clearly impossible. They have a contract marriage. Cedric cannot feel anything for her. That same evening, in the Duchy of Marinest, the Archduke was informed that the Indigentia family had arrived in the capital. An irritated Calvados rushed around the castle like a wild animal. The advisor couldn't read on his face how the man reacted to the news. He seemed to become even more worried, and he expressed an immediate desire to personally go in search of his daughter. The tied-up Daphne didn't understand where she was. She only occasionally heard the conversations of her captors. The poor girl could not see anything and could not move. Her whole body was numb. She didn't know how much time had passed, who had kidnapped her, or why. Daphne was overcome with anger and despair. In this timeline, she did everything to live a peaceful life. She needed to pull herself together. Surely her father and the entire Marinus Duchy were already looking for her. After all, Daphne had been in worse conditions. Last time, she was locked in the dungeons of the Imperial Palace with no hope of release. Now she is no longer a helpless girl. The kidnappers will be very disappointed, expecting to encounter a child. Meanwhile, our friends were approaching the point indicated by Alonso. This place was almost outside the city. Having hidden, they soon heard footsteps, and then they saw a tall figure in a black robe. The man was clearly waiting for someone and was nervous. This was indicated by his nervous gait and clenched fists. Hearing footsteps behind him, the figure turned around with nervous impatience. Judging by the voice, it was clearly a man. However, he categorically did not expect to see Cedric behind him. Instantly casting a spell, Cedric trapped the man with gravity magic. The figure froze in the center of the shimmering circle. Cedric advised her not to move. Elia and Caleb were already rushing to help Cedric. The man crouched on the grass seemed strangely familiar to his friends. Cedric explained that they followed the magical trail left by this man. Marquis Reynold Babylon hid his magic very poorly. The Marquis exclaimed in his heart that he had turned to the Dark Guild to have them steal Daphne for him, but these idiots left a magical trace and set him up. And now Cedric has finally ruined the man's plans. Elia remembered what was said about Reynold in the original novel. At some point, he was called a future great magician and was predicted to have a great future. He lived his life thinking he was superior to everyone else, until Cedric, a true magical genius, came along. Even at a young age, he told the Marquise the nuances of the most complex spells. In essence, he taught the one who should have been his teacher. Since the age of 10, Cedric has been demonstrating the unique magic of the Indigentia family, which was shown to him only once. Reynold Babylon was not capable of such a thing even in his wildest dreams. Cedric not only repeated each of the Marquise's spells the first time, but also strengthened them himself. The boy performed magic without thinking, perceiving it as breathing. And now, before the flabby Marquise stood the greatest magician of his era. The Marquis' only hope all this time was the curse that tormented Cedric. But then Elia appeared and ruined all his plans to seize power. And now Reynold was shouting that this lowly girl, who had plunged the duchy into chaos, was to blame for everything. Elia shouldn't have existed at all. However, until now, it was unclear where Daphne was. It was necessary to beat a confession out of the man. Cedric loudly demanded to know the whereabouts of the Duchess Marinist. All three were misled by both the Marquise's feigned anger and his hunched posture. Reynold was still dangerous. Marquis Babylon said that Daphne was in a hut upriver. His willingness to cooperate seemed very suspicious, especially after his hysteria. The friends started to head in the direction indicated by the Marquise, but Reynold called out to them again. He continued to describe the route to the hut and was clearly stalling for time. At that moment, tied up, Daphne clearly heard the noise of the door opening. She called out to the kidnapper, hoping to engage in dialogue with him or at least recognize his voice. No one responded, and the girl began to hope that it might be rescuers. When they reached the hut, Elia, Cedric, and Caleb found a lock on the door. Cedric suspected a magical seal, but Elia rushed forward and simply broke the lock with her bare hands. The stunned brothers watched as the metal broke in the fragile girl's fingers. Elia rushed into the hut, expecting to see Daphne, or at least a herd of fairies there. However, what they saw stunned the friends even more. The hut was empty. Marquis Reynold Babylon, as expected, lied to them. Daphne, meanwhile, felt gentle hands carefully untying her bonds. A gentle female voice assured that everything would be all right, and that the young Duchess would soon be free. When the blindfold fell from Daphne's eyes, she was surprised to see Gerald Babylon standing in front of her. The angry friends returned to the Marquis, who was still sitting, captivated by Cedric's magic. The hut was empty. The Marquis had lied, and was clearly stalling for time, misleading them. Cedric asked about Daphne's whereabouts one last time. The Marquis replied that he had nothing left to lose, and that he would now reveal the truth. Reynold jerked his head up to look at Elia, and roared that he had been simply trying to protect Daphne all this time. Elia must surrender immediately. It was Elia who brainwashed the brothers, falsely accused Gerald, and kidnapped Princess Marinist. She must hand herself over to the authorities immediately. At that very moment, young Daphne was talking to her savior, Gerald. The woman said that Elia hired a dark guild to kidnap the girl. The villainess then demanded that the girl be hidden in a closet in the hut. Gerald also said that the reason for this was Elia's revenge. Allegedly, Elia learned that Daphne could lift the curse from Cedric, and therefore decided to kidnap her. Moreover, Elia threatened the entire Babylon family, forcing them to kidnap Daphne, but they refused. And to hide her plans, the villainess accused Gerald of cruelty to Caleb and achieved his exile. Gerald would have found Daphne sooner, but the Marquise's entire family was forbidden to leave. Daphne listened and became more and more confident in Gerald's poison. No one knew why, but the Babylon and Marinist families maintained fairly warm relations. Therefore, Marquis Reynold was confident of his victory. Duchess Marinist had known Gerald since childhood and trusted her implicitly. The girl had no doubts about everything Gerald told her. Daphne herself taught Gerald the magic of the mirror shield. The imperial family trusts the Marinist family, and they trust the Babylon family. The Archduke will not be able to leave everything as it is after learning about the kidnapping of his beloved daughter. Cedric and Caleb will not be able to do anything because punishment will come from the Emperor. A frightened Elia looked at her brothers. Of course, neither Cedric nor Caleb believed the Marquis's words. However, the old beetle planned everything quite cleverly. Elia asked again if the same trust still existed between her and her brothers. Cedric looked at the girl with confusion, but Caleb simply took her hand and assured her that everything would be fine. After all, Elia has her and her brother. No one would dare harm her. The boy was very sweet in his naivety, and it was very touching how he rushed to help Elia. Touched, Elia rushed to hug Caleb, almost suffocating the boy in his arms. But in fact, what worried Elia most was the fate of young Daphne. Elia was so absorbed in the mystery of the fairy and Cedric's curse that she completely forgot about the novel's main character. The only consolation was that the Babylon family wanted to pull the wool over Daphne's eyes, which meant the girl was not harmed. It's also very interesting to know who the Marquis was waiting for in the forest. After all, when Reynold was found, he was clearly upset because he expected to see someone else. If his behavior wasn't a pretense, then Daphne is somewhere in these woods, and we can't just sit here and wait for Reynold to talk. With these words, Elia ran into the forest, abruptly letting go of Caleb's hand. Turning around as she ran, the girl shouted that she wanted to climb the hill and look at the forest from above. Cedric tried to stop her, saying that the forest could be dangerous. After all, they don't know what kind of accomplices the Marquis might have. But Elia didn't care. Caleb, not listening to Cedric, rushed after the girl. On the one hand, the boy was still good at magic, but on the other hand, now he had to worry about his brother too. Marquis Reynold continued to drag out time, clearly waiting for someone. Gerald and her father were already mentally celebrating the victory. The woman was just now preparing to take Daphne from the hut, thinking that the young Duchess Marinest trusted her completely. Elia had nowhere to run. The Babylon family had trapped her, but they didn't know one important fact about Daphne. The Duchess had returned from the past. In front of Gerald was a grown woman, albeit in the body of a 6-year-old child. Daphne Marinest was in no hurry to take Gerald's hand. She remembered who came to visit her in prison in the previous branch of reality. No amount of sweet talk from Gerald could move her. The girl calmly asked if the teacher had any evidence to support her words. Of course, Gerald was not ready for this. The girl stated that she was not going to go anywhere and was not sure that the woman's words were true. Gerald had no choice but to create a scene of insulted trust. She said she had always cared for the young Duchess, and now this cold tone was cutting her to the heart. Daphne Marinest remembered her past life, how Gerald maintained a good relationship with a girl who couldn't use magic, only because of the Duke's favor, and how she later came to prison and mocked the broken Daphne, convincing her that she was worthless and had brought shame on the entire Duchy of Marinest. Now Gerald is trying to frame an innocent man with Daphne's help. It's definitely not worth going anywhere with her. You need to look for a chance to escape from this terrible woman. A stunned Gerald tried to pull herself together. The whole plan was falling apart before her eyes. Noticing the confusion in the woman's eyes, Daphne made an attempt to get around Gerald and get outside. However, the villainess suddenly rushed forward and grabbed the girl by the hand. Gerald said she wouldn't let her go into the forest alone. After all, there are a lot of dangers in the forest. They can simply hold hands and sit in a corner, strengthening their trust again. Gerald accompanied her words with a steel grip and a frightening look. She pulled the girl into a corner, with the clear intention of causing harm. Visions of her previous life flashed before Daphne. She had been so weak then, and now she is locked in the body of a child and can't do anything. Now, Gerald will use some kind of subjugation or memory-correcting spell. Daphne is a helpless little lamb again. Despair gave the girl strength. With a sharp jerk, she tore the dress, leaving the sleeve in Gerald's hands. And while the woman was coming to her senses, she rushed to the door. Daphne ran out of the hut at top speed. The door swung open, and the rays of the setting sun briefly blinded the girl. She found herself again in a situation where she had to run through the forest to save her life. Suddenly, the girl heard a chorus of male voices around her. Blinking, she saw a crowd of people in black robes surrounding the hut. They said that the people of the Marquis of Babylon had come to rescue the young Duchess. They are happy to escort Daphne to safety. A little girl shouldn't run through the forest alone. Daphne's mind flashed back to the scene when they tried to catch her in the forest after she escaped. Without listening to the men, she turned around and ran as fast as she could into the thicket. At that moment, Gerald, who had recovered from the shock, ran out of the hut and the chase began. The girl had to be caught quickly without causing her any harm. Daphne, however, was focused on getting the most out of her body. She didn't understand why this kept happening to her. This time, she did everything to avoid being at the center of political intrigue, and still got herself into trouble. And then the girl ran out into the clearing in front of the cliff that had cut her life short last time. Once again, she is on the edge of the abyss, and the enemies are already breathing down her neck. Confirming these thoughts, Gerald's voice came from below, calling for the young Duchess. The frightened girl turned around and began to back away. Just like then, her feet slipped off the edge and she began to fall. Gerald and the Babylon family guards froze in fear. Daphne closed her eyes as she fell, resigned to the fact that her second life was ending. Suddenly, the girl felt a strong hand grabbing her. It was Elia, who arrived at the last moment. Before she could catch Daphne, Elia jumped after her and hugged the girl, turning around in the air. Now she is in the body of a fairy, and the rock is not that high. Elia's body should be able to withstand it. Daphne looked at the stunning eyes, like precious stones, and realized that this was a fairy. It was the fairy who tried to put a curse on Prince Renoa, and now, for some reason, he saves her. Elia closed her eyes, preparing for the blow, but for some reason, it did not come. At the last moment, Cedric caught them in his arms, furious at Elia's recklessness. Gently lowering Daphne and Elia to the ground, the man continued to voice his concerns. Elia joyfully hugged Cedric and thanked him for saving her. It was clear to her that the man was not actually angry. It was a reaction to fear for her. Finally, Cedric breathed a sigh of relief. It was good that they were both okay. And on top of the hill, Gerald clenched her fists furiously. Now the Babylon family's plan was definitely in vain. At the foot of the hill at the same time, our friends were waiting for Caleb, who had fallen behind his brother who had used magic. The Marquis's men, noticing the characteristic glow of gravitational magic, began to back away in fear. Nobody wanted to get involved with the people from the Duchy of Indigentia. At that moment, Gerald heard the men fall to their knees, muttering words of greeting. Caleb, the future Archduke of Indigentia, came out to them. The 7-year-old boy was scary. First of all, he announced that everyone on the hill should not move. They are declared criminals before the Empire. Daphne couldn't believe she was still alive. For some reason, the people from the Duchy of Indigentia and this strange fairy came to her aid. And now, Elia was telling how they found Marquis Renaud, and then Daphne herself. For some reason, this strange fairy takes care of the girl. And for some reason, I'm very glad that she, Daphne, is okay. Moreover, both Cedric and Elia are ready to do everything for the protection and comfort of the young Duchess. Realizing that she had not introduced herself, Elia began to happily talk about the Duchy of Indigentia. Daphne began to feel trust in this strange fairy and asked to take her hand. The girl wants to hold her hand until they get to safety. Of course, Elia happily took the girl by the hand. The young Duchess looked very sweet, just like Caleb. Daphne, taking Elia's hand, felt warmth and calm. Now she was truly safe. Trying not to let Daphne hear, Elia asked Cedric where the Marquis of Babylon was. The girl saw that Caleb ran after her, but Cedric remained to guard Renaud. Cedric calmly replied that the Marquis was not far from here. Rushing to the rescue, Cedric pulled Renaud along with him using magic. The man also said that Caleb was currently dealing with Gerald. Suddenly, Daphne Marinest came to life and began actively waving her arms towards the distant bushes. From there, her father, Archduke Marinest of Calvados, approached them. He followed the magical trail to look for his daughter. If it weren't for Cedric, Caleb, and Elia, he would have been hopelessly late, and the tragedy that happened in the old timeline would happen again. The father carefully hugged his daughter, whispering words of forgiveness in her ear. Elia and Cedric just stood there, happy that everything had ended so well. It was possible to return to the duchy in peace. Peace had finally reigned in the Marinus family. Suddenly, Calvados tore himself away from Daphne and looked angrily straight at Elia. The next moment, the man attacked Elia with magic, shouting something about how Elia had lost all shame and fear after doing this to his daughter. Daphne, not understanding anything, hid behind her father. Cedric shielded Elijah, saving her from the magical attack. It was clearly a misunderstanding, but given the magical capabilities of both parties, it could have cost someone their life. Elia tried to shout to Calvados through the noise of the magical storm. Archduke Marinist was completely convinced that Elia was to blame for everything. Due to concern for his daughter, the loving father simply could not think straight. Hiding behind Cedric, Elia frantically thought about how to get through to Calvados. Suddenly, Daphne grabbed her father by the cheeks and sharply turned him towards her. The girl demanded that they stop attacking the people who saved her. She explained that Elia had risked her life to save Daphne from falling. The young Duchess was kidnapped by the Marquis of Babylon and his family. Right now, this whole pack is at the top of the hill. They did all this to frame Elia, Cedric, and Caleb. Moreover, the Marquis of Babylon's magic can be traced back to this point. This is irrefutable proof. Daphne doesn't understand how the Babylon family has earned Calvados's favor. At this question, the Archduke's expression changed and even seemed to give in. Elia once again began to remember the original novel. However, the book said nothing about the reasons for such a close connection between Babylon and Marinest. The question is why Archduke Marinest doesn't trust Indigentia. The girl looked at Cedric, who was barely holding back from striking back with magic. It was this moment that Caleb chose to appear. Elia turned happily to the boy, but the smile itself disappeared from her face. The boy looked like a demon. Without raising his head, Caleb said that he knew the reason for such close communication between Babylon and Marinest. Archduke Calvados would prefer that Caleb tell the story, or he will finally find the courage and tell it himself. Caleb understands that the situation was emergency. The Archduke of Calvados's daughter had been kidnapped, but this does not absolve him of responsibility for the attack on the members of the Indigentia family and for the false accusations that Calvados threw in their faces. Caleb intends to file a formal complaint to the Emperor regarding the Duchy of Marinest. At that moment, no one saw the 7-year-old boy in Caleb. The Archduke of Indigenia stood before them. Calvados bowed his head submissively, admitting his guilt. The thing is that the man assumed that after Cedric's curse, Indigentia would take revenge on Marinest. This is why the Archduke readily believed the story of the Marquis of Babylon. Calvados expressed a sincere desire to understand the situation. Cedric raised his hand, and his magic transported Renaud and Gerald to the foot of the hill. Although Archduke Marinest found it very difficult to believe the betrayal of the Babylon family, but he is ready to arrange a confrontation and listen to Renaud's version right now. Marquis Renaud began to beg for the gravity spell to be lifted and for him to be given the opportunity to explain himself. Perhaps the dukes simply misunderstood the intentions of the Babylon family, to which Caleb reasonably noted that the kidnapping of Duchess Daphne had taken place, and for this, the Marquis of Babylon must be brought before the aristocratic court. At this moment, the personal guard of the Duke of Calvados arrived. The father, distraught with grief, had far outnumbered his bodyguards, but now the numerical superiority was again on Marinest's side. The kidnapping story is indeed over. The Babylon family has lost. Marinest's personal guard was called the Knights of the Golden Lion. Even though Archduke Calvados was now their ally, Elia felt a moment of discomfort, but not as uncomfortable as Gerald, who began to sob and beg for mercy. Her father was still holding on, but the former etiquette teacher had completely lost all trace of aristocracy. Neither Elia nor anyone else felt the slightest bit sorry for her. At that moment, young Daphne called out to Elia in a timid, quiet voice. The girl once again thanked Elia for saving her and said that she had an inconvenient request. A worried Elia suggested that Daphne was injured, but the girl replied that everything was fine. The thing is that the request is rather familiar and not typical of an aristocrat. Daphne would like to call her savior, Sister Elia. The girl looked so cute that Elia couldn't help but let out a sigh of admiration. Of course, it will be more convenient for the young Duchess. As befits a main character, Daphne Marinest had a lot of love and strength. Even more embarrassed, the girl asked if they would return to Indigenia right away. She would like to stay with her little sister Elia a little longer. The girl was deeply shocked by Elia's actions, who jumped off a cliff for the sake of a stranger. And after that, Elia found the strength to smile and rejoice, even despite Calvados' attack. Daphne thought that she really wanted to get to know Elia better and become like her. However, Cedric had already called out to Elijah. He was ready to move his family back to the duchy. Daphne approached and thanked the man too, saying that she wanted to establish a connection with the Indigentia family. Cedric bowed politely and replied that he was glad that young Lady Marinest was well. Cedric knelt down in front of her, and Daphne's eyes lit up romantically. One day, Prince Renoa will stand before her as well. Of course, Cedric will be very happy to invite Daphne to visit, with the consent of her father. In response, Daphne hugged the man around the neck for a moment and whispered something in his ear. Looking at Cedric's shocked face, Elia could only assume it was about the curse, and Daphne just giggled happily and said that she was glad that the information was useful. All attempts to find out from Cedric what they told him were unsuccessful. Daphne, holding her dress, hurried to her father and his knights. Cedric took Elia aside to have a serious talk with her. The girl must promise that she will never act alone again. She must always stay close to Cedric. Elia agreed, thinking that today's behavior was a violation of the marriage contract on her part. Cedric looked at Daphne, but thought how scared he was for Elia today. Caleb also looked at the beautiful Duchess Marinest, but his red eyes still shone with anger. Even though everything ended well, the boy's magical intuition told him that this was only the beginning. The native castle of Indigentia greeted us with beautiful clear weather and a sparkling starry sky. After taking a bath, Elia went out onto the balcony and began to think over the events of the day once again. We were able to save Daphne and find the real kidnapper. The Babylon family was forever deprived of the opportunity to make insidious plans. The young Duchess Marinest was perfectly fine, and that was the most important thing. The adventure ended happily, and it was time to go to bed. At that moment, there was a quiet knock on Elia's chambers. Despite the late hour, Cedric arrived. He wanted to talk about something very important. But first, for some reason, he asked about Elia's well-being. The girl sheepishly replied that everything was fine and invited the man in. At the same time, she wondered if she had really become so dear to Cedric. Elia admitted that she couldn't sleep, so she went out onto the balcony and admired the stars. Today's moon is incredibly beautiful. They could admire her together. Cedric walked in confused. Apparently, it was really just worry that had brought him to Elia. The couple admired the beautiful starry sky in silence. Elia asked if Cedric liked the view. Cedric replied that the sky was truly beautiful, but he looked at Elia laughing. The man thought that he had been looking at Elia since the moment she arrived at the castle and still couldn't stop admiring her. It was this romantic moment that Cedric used to say that the marriage should be concluded as soon as possible. The Babylon family will now disappear from aristocratic life. Their followers will also lose influence. The Marquis himself will most likely face the death penalty, and this is the perfect time to calmly prepare for the wedding. Even though the Marquis deserved his punishment, the girl still felt a little uneasy. Cedric's eyes widened in fear, and he grabbed Elia's hand. There was only a scratch on her arm, which the girl received while running in the forest, but even she greatly worried the maniac Cedric. Apparently, he was one of those anxious men who want to hide their chosen ones in a golden coffin. And now Cedric began to clench his fists and repent. They say that it is because of him that Elia is constantly exposed to danger in the duchy, but he is not fulfilling his function as a protector. Without thinking twice, Elia extended her hands and pulled Cedric's lips into a smile. In a tone that brooked no argument, she declared that Cedric looked much better smiling than worrying. The stunned man simply couldn't find what to answer. Elia said that all the dangers were the result of her own actions and her responsibility. It was Elia who demanded that Daphne be saved. Cedric simply agreed with her proposal. It was Elia who made the decision to rush into the forest and then jump off the cliff. Cedric has absolutely nothing to apologize for, and from now on, only good things will happen to them. It will be good if this turns out to be a fairy's prophecy. Cedric was finally convinced that Elia was a good person, even though he knew nothing about her. The night was getting cooler, and the couple decided to go inside. They both worked hard today and deserved a rest. But Elijah continued to be tormented by doubts. She continues to keep secrets from Cedric. Moreover, the girl herself was confused about who she was in this story. She may not be the fairy who cast the curse, but she must do everything to help Cedric get rid of him. The story takes us to a mysterious castle, to the room of a beautiful woman. The servants are afraid to attract her attention once again. She is as dangerous as she is beautiful. It is at this moment that the dangerous woman learns of Elia's existence and begins to see her as a threat. After letting go of the maid, the woman continues to look thoughtfully at the same starry sky. It looks like our friends have a new enemy, and it is none other than the Empress. She is much more dangerous than the Babylon family. A few days later, Reynolds' entire family was executed. The Marquis's severed head was put on public display. It's good that the friends quickly returned to indigentia, and Caleb did not have to see such atrocity. Marquis Renaud fully deserved his fate, but still, this was a bit too much. However, now the influence of Babylon had completely disappeared, and it was possible to concentrate on preparing for the wedding. A lot has changed in the duchy as well. Vassals who had previously ignored Elia were now racing to serve her. The ladies of the court praised her outfits and were eager to help with the wedding preparations. To be honest, Elia felt the falseness behind all these proposals. He and Olivia took turns coming up with excuses to get rid of the vassals, which of course was not very worthy of an aristocrat, but it helped maintain peace of mind. The most annoying thing, of course, were the vassals, who had previously not been shy about demonstrating their negative attitude. The fate of the Marquise shocked everyone, and now they were trying to curry favor. Cedric, with his characteristic came, advised Aaliyah to simply ignore everyone. The good news is that attitudes towards Caleb have also changed. Most likely, the vassals did not have any real hatred towards Caleb. They behaved this way because of the benefits they received from Reynolds. After a short period of time, all preparations for the wedding ceremony were completed. These days were truly calm and serene. Aaliyah noticed that she was increasingly thinking about Cedric, against her will. She remembers his smile and his touching care. This was also facilitated by the fact that, suffering from idleness, Elia often cooked for the man. And now the girl turned into Cedric's office with a plate of cookies, and found Caleb there too. The boy immediately took the plate from Elia's hands and pounced on the food. Cedric, as usual, showed great restraint. He muttered that he was very grateful, but there was no need to put in so much effort for him or Caleb. While they were talking, the boy continued to eat the cookies. Elia said she was glad to see Cedric enjoying the food. His face immediately tells the story, because he can only taste the food that Elia has prepared. Elia also said that Cedric is very cute when he eats. He doesn't look at all like the stern head of a duchy. Cedric looked at Elia in amazement. The almost unfamiliar girl noticed details that no one had noticed before. Moreover, Cedric himself had never thought about it before. In a short time, Elia completely turned the man's life upside down. And not only Cedric himself, but also Caleb and the entire duchy. Just as the friends sat down to drink tea, a woman from the wedding dress salon arrived. She arrived earlier than Elia had expected, so they had to interrupt their tea party. And the girl also remembered that Caleb was currently taking business administration classes. It is not fitting for a future archduke to skip school and stuff his mouth with cookies. Remembering the story with Gerald, Elia was worried that the boy was having problems with the teacher again. But no, Caleb just wanted to spend more time with Elia. The girl promised that they would definitely meet after classes and the dress fitting. Cedric thought that his little brother used to act like an adult. On the one hand, it was better for the future archduke. But on the other hand, Caleb was happy now. Cedric and Elia hurried to try on their wedding dresses, while Caleb went to class. Hearing that the dress was ready, Elia began to feel growing anxiety about the upcoming wedding. The idea that she would soon get married in the magical world sounded very unrealistic. And yet, this is exactly what Elia had to endure. Suddenly, Cedric decided to ask Elia how she felt about the upcoming wedding. For a usually cold and reserved man, this was the height of emotional intelligence. He suggested that Elia might be feeling depressed or anxious, but it turned out that the man didn't come up with this idea on his own. At the last dress fitting, the lady from the bridal salon hinted to Cedric that some brides are very nervous before the celebration. Many brides see their wedding as the key event in their lives, or they are forced to marry a man they don't love, in an unattractive room or in an unattractive appearance. All this puts a lot of pressure on the girls. Elia froze for a moment, realizing that Cedric was now showing concern, and he says almost directly that he is worried that Elia might not like him. Cedric, meanwhile, was waiting for an answer about the girl's feelings. An uncharacteristic expression of confusion and uncertainty appeared on the man's face. Elia was quick to reply that she was fine, and she finds Cedric very handsome. Seeing the man's uncertainty, Elia started talking nonsense, becoming more and more embarrassed with each word. There was an awkward pause. Elia tried so hard to calm Cedric's embarrassment that she became completely confused about her own feelings. Cedric muttered that he understood and was very grateful for the frankness. After this, the girl began to look for an excuse to retreat. She made up a story on the fly that she had forgotten something important in her chambers, and now she urgently needs to find Olivia, who should help the girl. Cedric offered to go with her and help her search. Aaliyah's refusal was more violent than she intended, but she simply couldn't bring herself to look Cedric in the face. An embarrassed Cedric remained standing in the middle of the corridor. He recalled the words that young Daphne had said to him as he left. Sister Aaliyah told Daphne that she likes people with a beautiful smile. Most likely, Aaliyah meant the girl herself, but for some reason Cedric couldn't stop thinking about it, especially after the evening on the balcony, when Aaliyah said that a smile suits a man very well. This probably means that the girl thinks that he, Cedric, has a beautiful smile, which means Elia probably likes him. For some reason, thinking about this was both pleasant and very disturbing. Enchanted, Cedric didn't notice that he had been sitting there with a glassy gaze for quite some time, but advisor Edwin noticed. The man had just come to Cedric to discuss pressing matters, and noticing his friend in such a state, the documents almost fell out of Edwin's hands. The advisor noticed that Cedric had been acting strangely lately. Sometimes he rejoices for no reason, sometimes he becomes aggressive, and sometimes, as now, he freezes for a long time and withdraws into himself. Cedric initially flared up at his friend, but then agreed with him. It was time to go and try on my wedding dress. Quickly explaining to the woman that Elia would be arriving later, Cedric prepared himself for another clothing test. The owner of the wedding salon was called Angela, and she seemed like a very nice woman, although her sweetness was easily explained by the tidy sum that she would receive as a result of the aristocratic wedding. At this point, Angela began to praise Cedric's beauty. It turned out that she had partially heard the man's conversation with Elia. Madame Angela was a commoner, but she had enough experience to arrange the wedding of the leading gentleman. Of course, in this case, Angela was also driven by curiosity. Elia, after all, was also a commoner. There were many rumors that Cedric was simply using Elia and planning to cast a curse on the girl. But while Angela attributed selfish motives to Cedric, the man was simply embarrassed, and he asked Madame not to tell anyone about his explanation with Elia. A few hours later, the fitting of Cedric and Elia's costumes was completed. Elia didn't care, but Olivia assured the girl that the dress was perfectly chosen. He and the maid were already drinking tea, and Cedric decided to discuss his tuxedo with Madame Angela once again. The man was clearly much more concerned about his appearance than Elia. Of course, the newlyweds haven't seen each other's outfits yet. That should only happen at the ceremony. All that was left was to enjoy the tea and wait for Cedric to finish showing off. Elia asked Olivia what wedding matters were next on the schedule. The woman's answer made Elia choke. Next, according to the plan, the newlyweds must agree on their wedding room. Somehow, Elia forgot that she would have to maintain the marriage legend to the end, which means sleeping with Cedric, at least in the same room. The fact that this is a contract marriage should not be known to anyone, except the two of them and Caleb. It was this moment that Cedric chose to run into the room where the girls were drinking tea. Cedric's shirt was unbuttoned, his muscular torso immediately making Elia blush. Angela ran after the man, shouting that he should button his clothes properly, while Elia coughed into a napkin, trying not to look at Cedric. The man, as if on purpose, was spinning around nearby. Sincerely not understanding the girl's reaction, he asked if everything was okay with her. Olivia, who knew exactly what was going on, assured her that the lady had simply choked, and Mr. Cedric must quickly sort out his outfit in order to have time to agree on a room for the newlyweds. At this point, Cedric blushed along with Elia, turning around sheepishly, but still without buttoning his shirt. The man returned to the fitting room. A chuckling Angela was waiting for him near the door. Madame herself was convinced that reality was very different from rumors. Elia didn't look like a commoner being used at all. Cedric was clearly head over heels in love with the girl, even though he didn't realize it yet. So, after a few hours of blood, sweat, and tears from the newlyweds, the costumes were agreed upon. Madame Angela looked completely satisfied with the work done. Having exchanged the usual pleasantries, the woman took the risk of asking the question that was troubling her. She noted the attractiveness of both spouses, and she was also incredibly excited by the fact that Cedric had finally found the person he liked. That's why Angela is very interested in what it is about Cedric that attracted Elia. The girl was taken aback by the tactlessness of the question. However, insulting Madame with silence was even more impolite. So Elia bleated something about Cedric's masculinity and kindness. But Angela didn't stop there and asked Cedric the same question. But the man, without any embarrassment, answered seriously. He was drawn to the way Elia tries to understand other people and help them, and the way she rushes to help strangers without hesitation. When Cedric saw the girl risking her life, he began to fall in love with her. And it was obvious to everyone in the room, except Elia, that the man was telling the truth. Elia thought that Cedric was just playing to the crowd very well, or maybe the girl really wanted to think so as not to upset her heart unnecessarily. Although even she couldn't help but notice that Cedric had been acting strange lately. With all these chores, the newlyweds didn't notice how evening had come. Cedric went to his office to sort out some paperwork, but Edwin was waiting for him there. The advisor asked with a slight sneer if Cedric liked the honeymoon room. After all, Edwin himself put a lot of effort into planning everything for it. After Cedric's affirmative answer, Edwin decided to report on the assigned mission. It turns out that Cedric had once instructed the advisor to find out about Elia's past. Edwin's spies questioned all the inhabitants of the villages around Elia's house. It was not possible to gather any information. No one remembered Elijah and knew nothing about her. It looked strange. Edwin planned to expand the search area. The matter was further complicated by the fact that Elia was believed to be a pure-blooded fairy. Cedric instructed the advisor to continue the search and leave him for now. Turning away, the man reflected on how he had allowed his love to blind him. It's important to remember that Elia could be anyone. This whole story with memory loss and complete lack of information seems very strange. Elia, meanwhile, wandered mindlessly around the castle. The girl was frankly bored. She had nothing to do except cook. Suddenly, Elia heard Caleb's voice behind one of the doors. It was not nice to eavesdrop, but the boy called the girl by name. Carefully peering through the crack, the girl saw the young duke walking around the room with a notebook in his hand. The boy was alone and was clearly talking to a notebook. Elia remembered that Caleb had been constantly carrying this notebook with him lately and writing things in it. Everything would be fine, but talking to a notebook is already strange. At that moment, Caleb stopped and muttered that this was absolutely impossible to believe. He will conduct an investigation into Elia himself. It turns out that this notebook contains information about Elia. Perhaps the boy figured out that the girl was a fairy, and he suspects Elia of cursing his brother. Hiding behind a column, Elia waited for Caleb to leave the room. It was wrong to do this, but she had to read this notebook. Elia couldn't bear the thought that the boy had been pretending all this time. With trembling hands, the girl opened Caleb's personal diary, expecting to find anything in it. But the result exceeded all her expectations. The child vividly described how he was able to get Elia to give up her diet. Next came his worries that Elia would go on a diet again before the wedding, and the girl should not lose a single gram of her weight. Next came a cunning plan to get Elia to eat desserts. The girl breathed a sigh of relief. She really had decided to get in shape before the wedding. It turns out that Cedric and Caleb noticed this and decided that she was starving herself. The rest of the pages were filled with purely sweet moments. Caleb recalled their conversations and how they cooked together. The child devoted 3 pages to memories of how the 3 of them looked at the stars. Elia had never read anything more touching. Caleb noted that his elder brother looked increasingly happier, and the duchy looked increasingly bright. The boy was always happy from the moment Elia arrived. The child really hoped that she would remain in the duchy even after the contract was fulfilled. And so, the happy, peaceful days of preparation are over. The wedding day arrived. Among the invited guests was the Marinist family. Little Daphne kept hurrying her father, afraid of being late for the beginning of the ceremony. The entire castle area was decorated for the upcoming celebration. Calvados Marinist followed his daughter with much less enthusiasm. He had originally planned to simply send gifts, but the events of recent weeks had changed everything. The Babylon family was publicly condemned for treason, and Marquis Renaud was executed. Because of this, past events began to resurface as rumors. For example, it was Daphne Marinist who reflected the curse from Prince Renaud, and it bounced back at Cedric. The only saving grace was that no one could discuss the Emperor and the Grand Duchies openly. Therefore, the vassals only whispered in corners that Cedric had helped Marinist, despite everything that had happened. They also recalled that Calvados still had not paid Indigentia proper compensation for what had happened. The main gossips immediately subscribed to the newspaper published by the duchy. Demand for the newspaper grew so much that a publishing house opened in the capital itself. Calvados also paid Indigentia a tidy sum of compensation. And now, I wondered what part of it this wedding hall was decorated with. Archduke Marinist would not have come to the celebration at all, but his beloved Daphne insisted. The girl said that she would never miss her sister Elia's wedding. Daphne was right now remembering her conversation with Caleb on the ill-fated day of her abduction. The Duke of Indigenia then accused her of being thick-skinned. The boy spoke in an inappropriate tone, but he could understand. Because of Daphne, the curse rebounded on Cedric, and the imperial family in Calvados were simply pleased that Prince Renoa was not harmed. Everyone hushed up the fact that Cedric was cursed, and now, with each passing day, he moves closer to a fate worse than death. Daphne doesn't even try to help in any way. She's just glad that the crown prince remains safe. Caleb's only hope is Elia. By marrying her, Cedric will be able to enter the Temple of Knowledge and find a way to remove the curse. But how dare Daphne act like they were friends with Elia? Duchess Marinest clenched her fists and replied that Elia herself decided to save her. The girl did nothing for this. Caleb replied icily that it was only because the situation was an emergency. Because of Daphne, Elia's beloved man suffered. She saved the girl out of a sense of duty and nothing more. The saddened girl once again thought that perhaps she should not have forced her father to bring her to the wedding. They sent her an invitation out of politeness. Otherwise, unnecessary rumors would have started to spread. Daphne could only hope that this was just Caleb's imagination. After all, it wasn't her sister Elia who told her all this personally. The girl was worried that she never got a chance to apologize in all the chaos of the kidnapping. Partly because of this, she found the courage to come to the wedding. Little sister Elia shouldn't hate Daphne. At this time, Elia was finishing the final preparations before the wedding ceremony. The dress seemed ugly to the girl. There were too many decorations. The veil was too heavy. Only Olivia helped, repeating over and over again that the lady could handle all of this. She looks amazing. Everything has been approved for a long time. The lady is just very nervous. Elia was already thinking about throwing a tantrum with tears when footsteps were heard outside the door and Edwin entered. The inspired advisor said that the young duke would be able to help Elia with any inconvenience. Caleb stood next to Edwin, ready to use gravity magic to ease Elia's burden. The boy was excited, but ready to do anything to help his beloved Elia. Elia waved her hands and tried to explain that it was all her own fault. When they were designing the jewelry, they and Olivia didn't take their weight into account at all. However, Olivia and Angela supported the idea. It would really help the bride significantly. The most powerful magic in the world was planned to be used for the banal reduction of the weight of wedding decorations. And that would be a great idea if the spell could be applied precisely. The boy immediately got down to business. At the same time, in another wing of the castle, Cedric was experiencing his own worries. Of course, his outfit was significantly simpler and lighter than the bride's attire. The man's thoughts were rather occupied with the safety and correct behavior of his vassals, and also Elia, who will become his wife today. Caleb's efforts were successful. Nothing else was pulling or threatening to collapse during the ceremony. The weight of the veil and jewelry was not felt at all. Elia thanked Caleb for such fine work. The teachers could be proud of the boy. Now nothing prevented Elia from marrying his older brother. Tears of emotion welled up in Caleb's eyes. The touched boy promised that he would scold Cedric if he caused trouble for Elia in the future. The girl laughed and replied that she relied only on Caleb in everything. The delighted boy declared that they would be able to live happily in the castle forever. Looking at the happy child, Elia did not dare to object to him. After all, the room is full of prying eyes and ears. No one needs to know that the marriage is by contract. And Elijah shouldn't upset Caleb now and talk about her future plans. So of course, Caleb, the three of them will live happily ever after in the castle. The child beamed and they moved together into the ceremonial hall. The vassals had already gathered, and everything was completely ready. Cedric stood at the altar with trepidation in his heart, waiting for his bride. He couldn't remember a time when he had been so nervous. The ladies of the court only added fuel to the fire by whispering about Cedric's beauty. Some of the vassals whispered that they could not believe that Cedric would marry a commoner. The man tried to single them out from the crowd and remember them. However, it turned out that this commoner was not afraid to bring a curse upon herself. Elia, who appeared accompanied by Caleb, was dazzling. No one paid any attention to Edwin, who opened the door for the girl. All thoughts flew out of Cedric's head. For a few moments, he stopped noticing everyone except Elia. The crowd let out a loud cry of admiration. The young bride really did look like a fairy. Elia approached Cedric, and he saw the girl's magnificence in every detail. Now the man didn't even notice his younger brother. According to etiquette, the hands of the bride and groom met. The wedding ceremony could begin. Despite her outward calm, Elia's head was in complete chaos. She's marrying a wonderful man in a magical world. Who would have thought? Both newlyweds simultaneously thought that perhaps they needed to say something to each other. They both started and both fell silent at the same time. Then they began vying with each other to praise each other for their participation in preparing for the ceremony. Elia was surprised to realize that she was absolutely happy. Soon, she will be able to enter the Temple of Knowledge and finally master her own magic, and then lift the curse from Cedric so that he and Caleb can live happily ever after. The priest pronounced the ritual words of the vow over the newlyweds. This is the beginning of another journey, and this path, one way or another, will lead to separation from the brothers. It's also very good that none of them have suspected anything yet. This gives Elia more time to figure out the situation. And then, perhaps, you won't have to explain anything. The perceptive Cedric saw that something was bothering the bride, but he dismissed it as wedding nerves. To the thunderous applause of their vassals, Cedric and Elia walked down the path towards their new life. When planning the ceremony, they deliberately excluded all the procedures they could. However, the long wedding speech still had to be endured. And of course, Cedric noticed that something was wrong with Elia's expression. Fortunately, the vassals' congratulations saved the girl from having to answer. The next part of the ceremony could begin. The wedding feast. Elia quickly turned Cedric's thoughts to food. Luckily, the girl prepared most of the food herself, and the man will be able to taste the dishes. At that moment, the door to the ceremonial hall swung open. A man unfamiliar to Elia stood on the threshold. It turned out that he was the Empress's personal servant. Everyone was shocked. The imperial family had long since announced that they would not attend the wedding. However, now a tall man walked majestically through the ranks of vassals. The sight of him gave Elia a bad feeling. Stopping a few steps from the newlyweds, the man cleared his throat and began to speak. The entire imperial court congratulates the Duchy of Indigentia on its wedding. The Empress also asks that her congratulations be conveyed separately to Cedric and Lady Elia. She is very sorry that due to state affairs, she cannot be present in person. She is even more sorry to pass on the bad news. Traces of an unknown person have been discovered in the Temple of Knowledge. The imperial family has not yet managed to catch the burglar. Therefore, for safety reasons, it has been decided to temporarily close the Temple of Knowledge to visitors. A murmur of indignation ran through the ranks of the vassals. It was unheard of for the imperial family to publicly admit to being unable to ensure the safety of the main temple. Elia looked at the messenger in stunned silence. Of course, the imperial family knew that marriage would help Cedric enter the Temple of Knowledge and lift the curse. This news means that the Empress does not want the curse to be lifted. For some reason, the Empress hates Indigenia. In effect, the imperial court has now publicly declared that Indigentia is in disfavor. Having finished his speech, the imperial envoy announced that he intended to leave. Enraged, Elia rushed forward, breaking all the rules of etiquette. Cedric hugged his bride, trying hard to pretend to his vassals that everything was under control. Thanks to the man, all the vassals thought that the bride had simply tripped. And he doesn't want to strangle the imperial servant right here and now. Having come to her senses, Elia stopped trying to break free from her husband's arms. It was necessary to experience the wedding ceremony and think everything over calmly. Once the official part was over, Cedric asked the advisor where the Empress's envoy had gone. Naturally, he returned to the palace immediately after the sad news was announced. There's nothing that can be done right now, but Edwin might find a way to talk to the messenger. Cedric better get back to Elia right now. If he leaves his wife immediately after the wedding, unnecessary rumors will spread. Cedric walked resolutely towards the newlyweds' quarters. Mrs. Elia acted throughout the official part as if nothing had happened. Even later, during family gatherings, she tried to keep a straight face, but she couldn't hide the trembling of her hands. The whole contract went to hell. Now it is unknown whether Cedric will even be able to get into the Temple of Knowledge before it is too late. Cedric thought hard about how he could help the girl. What happened may also be a reason to terminate the contract and get divorced immediately. Elia has every right to leave Indigentia now. Cedric found his wife in the dining room. Despite the late hour, the entire table was laden with food. Caleb and Daphne vied with each other to feed poor Elia. With childish innocence, they asserted that the best remedy for any trouble is food. Therefore, both Olivia and the cook must immediately bring even more delicious things. Cedric froze, not imagining how he could save the girl from such care. Elia noticed the man and cried out in joy. She clearly didn't know how to get the children to leave her alone. Taking advantage of the opportunity, the girl got out from behind the table under the pretext that she needed to talk to Cedric. The couple, picking up speed, disappeared through the door. On the street, Elia explained to Cedric that this was how the children showed their care for her. But it's still very good that they didn't feed her cakes to death. Cedric, despite the difficulty of the situation, admired his young wife. She was like the embodiment of love and beauty. Cedric hoped that she would stay in the duchy forever. And then he immediately scolded himself for thinking too selfishly. Suddenly, Elia jumped up and ran into the bushes. While Cedric was trying to figure out what was going on, the girl had already come running back, and she placed a wreath of blue roses on the man's head. The girl wove the gift herself. It went beautifully with Cedric's blue eyes. They thought that the wedding would bring them closer to breaking the curse. The news from the imperial court came as a heavy blow. Cedric noted with surprise that he had not considered this wedding as a way to lift the curse for a long time. For a long time now, all his thoughts had been occupied only by Elia, and the thought of ending this relationship for some reason made the man very worried. Elia, meanwhile, was telling Cedric about the laurel wreaths. In distant countries, there was a custom of awarding victors with laurel wreaths. They signify praise for the winner who has come a long way. Cedric's fight against the curse is a kind of marathon that he is sure to win, because Elia will definitely lift the curse from him. And so it happened that Cedric came to console Elia, and she consoled him. The man said that, in fact, it was he who should be giving the girl gifts and comforting her. After all, a wedding is the main holiday for the bride. Elia replied that it was a holiday for both of them, and she really enjoyed it. Cedric began to mumble that Elia might well marry another man when the contract was up, to which Elia simply replied that she was not going to marry again. She saw Cedric, and after him, the girl simply won't like anyone else. After this, the newlyweds finally moved on to discussing the problem. Cedric said that most likely there was no burglar at all. It is enough for the imperial family to say that they found the thief and he suffered the dragon's divine punishment, and then show any charred corpse? The fact is that the Temple of Knowledge is actually the lair of the dragon with which the first emperor made contact. In the original novel, Daphne was able to befriend the dragon, but that may not have happened yet. The imperial family cannot stop Indigenia forever. However, the fact that they announced the news at the wedding carries a stigma. Now all vassals will stay away from their family. Elia thought about the reasons for this behavior. The Empress clearly hated either Indigenia or Cedric himself. Elia began to seethe again at the injustice of what was happening. It didn't help at all, but mentally smashing the Empress's head made Elia feel better. First of all, the problem is how long the Temple of Knowledge will be forbidden to them. However, there is another way to get into the temple. Illegally. In the original, there was a teleporter in the Marinist family's attic, through which Daphne entered the temple. This is how the girl was able to become friends with the dragon. But it was a big secret. If Elia asks Daphne directly, the girl will probably be wary. After all, if the secret is revealed, the Marinist family will certainly not escape punishment from the Emperor. If only Elia could use her fairy memories and magic freely. First of all, Elijah and Cedric need to prepare for tomorrow's Oath of Allegiance ceremony, and then think about your position after it. Cedric extended his hand to the girl to lead her into the castle. The day had been long and eventful. It was necessary to rest before the next appearance among the vassals. Given the news, it will be difficult. Elia asked how she should behave, whether she should show sadness. Cedric replied that the girl could just be herself. They have a universal instrument of influence on public opinion, the duchy newspaper. Cedric doesn't really want to play on pity, but he needs to take advantage of it while he can. The imperial family itself gave them such a reason. Elia also suggested canceling the honeymoon. They say that the newlyweds cannot enjoy each other because they are worried about the impossibility of lifting the curse. This would add drama to the situation. Cedric replied that Elia was right, but they had both been waiting for this rest for so long. The couple planned to go to a private, gated resort owned by Cedric. It ranks #1 on the list of most popular honeymoon destinations. They planned everything to make it look like it was a love marriage. Elia noted that now everything would look awkward. Even if you fail to fool anyone, you must play desperation to the end. This way, they will show the Empress that everything is going according to her plan. And at that moment, they themselves will be able to observe and quickly respond to the situation. Elia fell silent when she saw that Cedric looked disappointed, as if the man cared whether they went on this honeymoon or not. Elia asked what made him so sad. Cedric shook his head and replied that Elia was absolutely right. You need to stick to her plan and show sadness and despair. Elia realized that, for some reason, Cedric was looking forward to his honeymoon. If this is true, it means that the man is not indifferent to her. At this moment, Cedric asked Elia to promise him something. He would like to go on vacation with her after this is all over, and they get to the Temple of Knowledge. The man asked Elia to spend their honeymoon with him later. A shocked Elia asked if Cedric had a reason for this. After all, there is a high probability that in the Temple of Knowledge, they will find a solution and lift the curse. And if so, the contract will be fulfilled, and they can get divorced immediately. Cedric frantically searched for a reason to persuade Elia. If they go on a honeymoon, it will be easier for Cedric to manipulate society. Cedric asked to look at the situation from his point of view. He was once an orphan who was adopted by a noble family. While Cedric was attending classes for successors, he decided to renounce the title of Archduke. Then he was cursed, but resigned to the lack of compensation. I just kept working for Caleb. Then Cedric almost blurted out a declaration of love for Elia. But the young Duke appeared. He went to look for Elia because he thought the girl was tired. Elia immediately switched to her younger brother Cedric. Suddenly, the boy hesitated, as if he wanted to say something, but did not dare. Of course, Elia noticed this. Turning around abruptly, Caleb said that he needed to rest and he would tell him later. And then the vassals swooped in with wedding congratulations. Wanting to get rid of them, the girl went back into the hall. But it turned out that there was still a whole crowd of courtiers there. Deftly maneuvering between them, Caleb disappeared behind the door on the opposite side. Finally, evening came, and all the events for today were finished. Elia felt completely drained. Being constantly surrounded by crowds is very tiring. The girl tried to catch Caleb after all the events, but he had already fallen asleep. Elia told the maid that she would come tomorrow morning and return to her room. Olivia burst into Elia's chambers. The woman began to say that today was the young wife's first wedding night. She is not allowed to come back to her chambers. She must go to the prepared room for the newlyweds. Fortunately, now fatigue has completely replaced the embarrassment. Olivia started suggesting that Elia dress up before such an important event. Olivia looked so inspired that there was no point in arguing with her. Elia obediently allowed them to dress her, thinking that Cedric was already asleep. However, Cedric could not calm down. He paced the room, clutching the cup. It's a contract marriage. He and Elia will just share a room. But there is only one bed in the room. Never in his life had the most powerful magician of our time been so worried. I needed to drink more water to somehow calm my burning cheeks. After casting an appraising glance at himself, Cedric left the room. Caleb couldn't sleep either. The young Duke was consumed with anxiety. His brother was so quickly on the road to recovery. But now all hope is lost. And so far, there is not a single thought about how else to help Cedric. Night finally came into its own. No matter how much Elia delayed this moment, she still had to come to her and Cedric's room. Of course, Olivia dressed her young wife to the nines. No glass of water would have helped Cedric cool his face. And while the man was thinking about Elia's outfit, the girl was only thinking about how tired they both were. They both had to somehow fall asleep in the same room. Cedric nobly gave up the bed to Elia and was ready to go to the sofa. But the girl caught his hand and advised him not to be stupid. The bed is wide enough for both of them to fit comfortably. Tired Elia stretched out under the blanket with pleasure. Cedric turned off the light with magic. The girl began to fall asleep almost instantly, but Cedric was still half sitting. Suddenly, Elia opened her eyes and asked to take care of her. From tomorrow, she will begin a new life in a new status. And having received Cedric's guarantee of care, Elia instantly fell asleep. Cedric gently ran his hand over Elia's cheek. In her sleep, the girl's usual serenity was replaced by anxiety. She looked like she was carrying a heavy burden. Elia had a nightmare from her previous life. Paramedics resuscitated her brother Yoon. The attacks changed the color of his hair and eyes. He was dying. and Aaliyah had to just watch. Watch and do nothing. Aaliyah woke up from Cedric's loud screams. Judging by the man's reaction, he had been trying to wake up Aaliyah for quite some time. But the girl did not wake up. Aaliyah felt completely exhausted. Her head ached and was spinning. And then the servants' cries were heard from Caleb's room. Yun's death flashed before Aaliyah's mind's eye. Not remembering herself from fear, the girl jumped up and ran into Caleb's room. Despite his training, Cedric couldn't keep up with her. Aaliyah burst into the young duke's room, throwing the doors open with a bang. Servants ran around the room in panic with basins of water and some rags. They said they called a doctor, but he never showed up. Caleb, curled up on the bed, groaned in pain. Aaliyah immediately thought that it was all her fault. She abandoned Yun then, and now Caleb. Cedric shook the girl by the shoulders, trying to calm her down and say that he would look after the boy. But Aaliyah did not hear the man. Completely immersed in the world of her past. Her parents are no longer there. No one will protect her or her brother anymore. Cedric's warm hands slowly brought Aaliyah back to reality. If she is hugged, it means that not all is lost. It means that there is still someone who will take care of her. Gradually, the nightmare of her past life receded. Aaliyah is now in a new magical world. The girl thanked Cedric shyly, saying that she had calmed down. Then Aaliyah turned around, forcibly lifted Caleb from the bed, and hugged him. Not listening to his groans, the maid tried to stop her, but Aaliyah stood her ground. In his past life, when Yun had attacks, sometimes this was the only thing that helped. Hug and hold, whisper soothing words until the cramps pass. And Aaliyah cried and whispered to Caleb that everything would be okay, until the boy opened his eyes, going limp in her arms. Cedric and the servants breathed a sigh of relief at once. The young duke was clearly feeling better, and Cedric also remembered that Aaliyah had clearly named his younger brother Yun. She was definitely talking about how her memories came back when Caleb was around. Most likely the boy reminds Aaliyah of someone from her past, someone named Yun. In the chaos of alarms, none of them noticed the terrible magical creature lurking under the ceiling of the room. Something had absorbed Caleb's energy and was planning to return. A few hours later, the night situation was resolved, and dawn was approaching. Cedric returned to the honeymoon room alone and sat down tiredly on the edge of the bed. Aaliyah categorically insisted on staying the night with Caleb. Cedric offered to stay instead of her or with her, but the girl sent him off to rest under the pretext that she was used to this. Cedric made the logical conclusion that Aaliyah had already had to care for someone with similar attacks. Apparently, she was courting Yun, and now in her mind, this Yun and Caleb have merged into one. However, it doesn't seem like Aaliyah's memory has returned. Otherwise, she would have rushed to look for this Yun. It looks like the girl was acting unconsciously now. Or maybe the man named Yun is dead. So Aaliyah pours out her love on Caleb, who looks like him. Suddenly, Cedric felt worse, and at first he didn't even understand why. It was only after a few seconds that he realized that he was starting to lose his sense of touch. The curse has entered its next stage. The rays of dawn finally illuminated Caleb's room. Aaliyah lay for several hours almost without moving, afraid to disturb the boy's sleep. But the child slept peacefully for those few hours. The attacks never returned. At the same time, Aaliyah was worried about Cedric, because the development of the curse was connected with his moral state. And yesterday, the man suffered a severe nervous shock. Aaliyah didn't expect to be so suddenly plunged back into her past life. She remembered how the insurance money for her parents' death was stolen by relatives. The girl was left in poverty with a sick brother on her hands. She had nowhere to get money except by achieving success in sports. The Metal One would have provided him and his brother with a comfortable existence. Using this excuse, Aaliyah left her 2-year-old brother in the care of the owner of the rented room. She didn't know what to do right. The coach suggested that she bring Yun with her to the gym, but Aaliyah didn't want to be in debt or put her problems on display. And one evening, returning home, she found Yun in a fit. It happened when the aunt who rented them a room was away. The boy cried in pain for many hours alone, but the only thing Aaliyah felt was the fear of being left alone if Yun died. The ambulance arrived fairly quickly, but it was too late. The attack had completely changed Yun. His hair had turned gray, and his light brown eyes had become bloodshot, making him look so much like Caleb. The incurable disease gradually removed pigment from the child's entire body, drying it out completely. Aaliyah looked at the sleeping Caleb with tenderness, and I thought that perhaps the reason for her rebirth was a chance to atone for her guilt. Cedric, despite not having fallen asleep, started working early in the morning. Edwin reported closer to lunch that Elia and Caleb had finally woken up, and they invite Cedric to have lunch together. Cedric agreed, thinking that he needed to somehow talk to Elia about Yuna and tell them both about the new stage of the curse's development. Edwin willingly stayed in the office to finish the paperwork. However, at dinner, Caleb himself told a shocking thing. It turns out that the child had been having nightmares all this time. The last one was what brought him to the attack. Nightmares tormented the boy from the moment he arrived from Elia's house. He wanted to tell earlier, but everyone always had some kind of business that required an immediate solution. Olivia listened with a smile as Cedric immediately began to empathize with his little brother. The level of trust in the family has steadily increased. Elia asked Caleb if he remembered the plots of his nightmares. The boy replied that he hadn't remembered anything at all before. Only recently had things started to surface. It was clear that even in reality, in a bright room, the child was scared. Only thanks to the support of Cedric and Elia, the young Duke decided to begin the story. The dream always began on the deserted shore of a vast ocean. Caleb couldn't take his eyes off the waves rolling endlessly onto the shore. My legs seemed to be growing into the sand. My body became leaden. Gradually, the dark water began to cover my feet and ankles. Realizing this, the child began to back away, and the water, as if sensing it, began to rise faster and faster. At some point, the water began to cover my head, and it became increasingly difficult to breathe. And only in the moment of deepest fear, when Caleb thought that he would drown forever, did he wake up. Elia and Cedric looked at the boy sympathetically, not knowing what to say. But this time, Caleb's nightmare was different. This time, some strange dark substance approached the boy from the bottom of the ocean. She looked like a black figure with legs. A worm of recognition began to squirm in the back of Elia's mind. Caleb ran to his room, intending to draw his nightmare. Half an hour later, the boy had drawn a schematic of a huge black spider. The legs are bent at right angles. The body is covered with black fur. Everyone agreed that such a creature would frighten anyone. It didn't try to hurt the boy in his sleep. It just loomed menacingly, instilling terror. Elia frantically tried to remember. Something was said about such a creature in the original novel. The boy was clearly upset and scared. Cedric complimented his little brother, saying that drawing his fear was incredibly brave. Elia also supported the child and gently took his hand. Caleb is a good guy for being able to find the strength to tell an unpleasant story. Now the monster will have much less power over him. Confused, Caleb said he had a request. He wants to call Elia little sister. Until now, Caleb called the girl by her first name because he had to maintain his status as an archduke. But now Elia is officially part of the family. Therefore, since he calls Cedric his brother, he would like to call Elia his sister. Speechless, Elia looked at the boy, remembering the whole story with Yun. Caleb was very afraid of refusal, despite the fact that Elia allowed Daphne to call herself that. However, Elia asked to be called simply Elia. She had already gotten used to the boy calling her simply by her first name. There is no need to change the address and call her sister. Cedric looked at the girl in amazement. She had never refused Caleb anything before. The boy wanted to ask about the reasons for the refusal, but at that moment, his law teacher arrived. It was time for Caleb to go to class. Edwin, who entered, also reminded Cedric that he still had state affairs to attend to. Only Elia could afford to be alone with her thoughts, although Cedric promised to return immediately after meeting with the vassals, and Caleb promised to visit the girl in the evening. The boy looked calm and happy again. On the way to the office, Edwin expressed bewilderment at hearing Elia's final refusal. After all, there was nothing criminal in asking the girl to call him sister. Cedric didn't answer, but he was clearly thinking the same thing. Most likely, the reason is Elia's awakened memories. This is what we will need to talk to her about. Elia huddled on the sofa, left alone. Her heart skipped a beat when Caleb suggested calling her sister. Olivia asked fearfully if everything was okay with Mrs. Elia, because she looked strange. Elia imagined how Caleb would constantly call her sister, and she understood that she was getting deeper and deeper into indigentia. She projects Yoon's image more and more deeply onto Caleb, and Elia wants to see in Caleb, him specifically, and not the ghost of her past. The child does not deserve this kind of treatment. You have to look at Caleb as an individual. At this, Elia jumped to her feet, causing Olivia to let out a muffled cry. Without listening to her, the girl said that she needed to immediately look into Caleb's room. Olivia replied that the maids had cleaned it yesterday, and Mrs. Elia wouldn't find anything. But Elia replied that she just needed to check something. If Elia remembers the plot correctly, the creature from Caleb's dreams should have appeared only after Cedric's death. The creature was the demon Mephisto, who offered Caleb his power in exchange for eating his dreams. It is unclear why the demon appeared now. Cedric's death is still many years away. Finally, the day came when Cedric had to swear allegiance to the Duchy of Indigentia. Edwin watched with reverence as his friend spoke the ritual words. Thanks to the ritual, Cedric will become a full-fledged member of the family. But, in fact, he will also bring another curse upon himself. If he betrays his family, darkness will eat away at his bones and flesh. Having finished the ritual, Cedric stood up resolutely, as if all the weight of the magical layers had not been there. Without wasting any time, he announced his new assignment to Edwin. Find out who Yun is. This man must be from Elia's past, possibly dead. Of course, the easiest way was to simply ask Elia everything, but Cedric doubted that the girl would tell him the truth. The only thing that is clear is that it is most likely a boy, younger than Elia, closer to Caleb's age. And of course, we need to figure it out without attracting unnecessary attention. Elia lay face down next to Caleb's bed. A puzzled Olivia stood nearby, trying to lift her mistress. To all questions, Elia answered that she was not looking for anything and was simply looking. In the original, the demon Mephisto lived under Caleb's bed, but he was definitely not there now. If this is not dealt with, the demon could cause irreparable harm to the boy. The man who made a deal with the demon had terrible dreams of death every night, filled with what the victim lacks most. Suddenly, the girl turned around and noticed a dark lump on the chandelier, right above Olivia. The demon was found. The creature, twitching its claws terribly, prepared to jump. With a crash, the chandelier broke off and flew straight onto Olivia's head. Elia leapt forward, pushing the maid away and mentally preparing herself for a crushing blow. But there was a blinding flash, and Cedric appeared, pushing away the remnants of the chandelier with a magical pass. Sensing the danger threatening the girl, he instantly teleported. Still, it was not for nothing that the man was considered the most powerful magician in this world. Elia briefly told about the demon and pointed to the ceiling. An angry Cedric was scary, but Elia insisted that the demon must be caught alive. They must understand how the demon ended up here, who unleashed it on Caleb. Having pulled himself together, Cedric cast a cloaking spell on the demon and immobilized it. Meanwhile, Olivia apologized profusely for putting her mistress in danger. Elia, of course, replied that she did not blame her friend for anything. At that moment, Caleb and a breathless Edwin burst into the room. The advisor did not understand the reasons for Cedric's teleportation, but hurried to the castle as fast as he could. The boy looked in amazement at the broken heavy chandelier, and he was even more amazed to hear that the source of his nightmares had been caught. Cedric snapped his fingers and removed the demon from the ceiling, still leaving it in the magical bubble. The demon Mephisto, the Lord of Deception, has been tormenting Cedric's younger brother all this time. Elia was surprised that the man knew the name of this creature. Caleb poked at the magic bubble with childish curiosity. It seems that the appearance of the demon did not cause him any particular surprise either. Taking the bubble in his hands, Caleb suddenly expressed doubt that this spider bug could be the Sage of Indigenia. It was Elia's turn to be surprised. In the original, there was not a word about the sage. It turns out that the great demon that haunted Caleb was the protector of the Indigentia family. Elia was very lucky that Cedric was going through the fidelity ritual at that very moment. During the ritual, the man partially merged with the duchy and could sense everything that was happening within its borders. That is why he immediately felt that the girl was in danger. Having only managed to shout to Edwin that he had to go, Cedric disappeared in a flash of teleportation. The man in the room had a split second to assess the situation, but he made it, and he immediately realized that in front of him was a sage who obeyed Indigenia. The great demon Mephisto is the duchy's familiar. Without thinking twice, Cedric enclosed him in a magical cocoon. Yes, partly, so as not to slap at myself in a fit of rage, Elia asked Cedric to tell her where they actually got a real demon as a guardian. What to do with it also raises questions. But first I would like to hear the story. The Indigentia family received their title through marriage into the former imperial family. This happened when the empire was still ruled by fairies. and they waged numerous wars with other races, humans, dwarves, and others. The incident occurred just during the war with the dwarves. Caleb drew a very cute picture of the dwarf to make it easier for Elia to understand what was going on. The dwarves forged excellent weapons, but they were poor at tactics and strategy. They couldn't defeat the fairies and humans, so they looked for other ways to strengthen their influence. In this way, they were able to summon the demon of the underworld, Mephisto. The dwarves wanted to exploit the demon's strategic intelligence. The Indigentia family was chosen by the imperial court to defeat the demon, because gravity magic was considered one of the strongest. This kind of magic is ideal for fighting demons, but even gravity magic could not defeat the great demon. However, the demon offered the wizard a deal. Mephisto asked to be taught gravity magic, and in exchange, he offered to use his demonic power. Thus, the great demon became the sage of the Indigentia clan, and the empire escaped destruction. It was hard to believe that the spider trapped in the magic ball was a great demon. Of course, the imperial family still knows nothing about the agreement. Many people whisper about it, but no one has any proof. Thanks to Mephisto, Indigentia's magic was perfected. This is why, in the original, the demon often trained Caleb, making him, in the end, even stronger than Cedric. Caleb watched the cause of his nightmares with mixed emotions. Now the demon looks like a lump of cotton wool, which is what the boy said. Suddenly, a menacing demon burst out of the ball. Only now it looked like a cat. He screamed very cutely, demanding an apology. Caleb calmly replied that he was the future Duke of Indigentia, but the sage had been creating problems for a very long time. The demon cat, looking down, replied that he was hungry. Elia noticed that at first it was possible to talk with Caleb, and not just eat. Mephisto tried to snap back at Elia, but was immediately stopped by Cedric. The cat raised his paw menacingly and said that no one could tell him what to do. He was a sage with 9 eyes. Elia remembered that the number 9 was considered the most powerful in the world of local magic. That's probably why Mephisto bragged about it so much. But this does not give Mephisto the right to speak in such a tone. The demon cat began to snort, saying that no one could tell him what to do. Elia noticed that instead of talking, he almost killed the Archduke. And then Mephisto loudly asked why there was a fairy next to him at all. Elia looked at him, shocked that her secret had been revealed. Mephisto continued to say that fairies and demons are complete opposites. Therefore, Elia must be expelled from the castle immediately.